That bit did make me want to eat a lot of pies, I will confess.
It did sound very good, didn't
Yeah,
it?
I was like, ooh, I could really go a pie, but I have to keep reading this book. Hi, I'm Elizabeth Lux.
I'm Ben McKenzie.
Welcome to Pratchat, the monthly Terry Pratchett Book Club podcast.
Each month, we discuss one of Terry Pratchett's books or short stories with a special guest.
This month, it was hard to come up with a pun about the title that didn't chafe, so I'm just going to say it. We're reading Unseen Academicals.
And our returning guest is author and Pratchett essayist, Dr. Tansy Rayner Roberts. Welcome, Tansy.
Hi, it's lovely to be here.
Now, you've been on the show twice before, of course. But,
I have.
For our only two live shows at Discworld conventions.
Are they also your only two episodes that are an hour long?
No, we've had one or two shorter episodes.
but it's a rare group. Like, it's a small group. So 100% of our live shows and almost 100% of our shorter episodes.
That's right.
Yeah.
We're making up for it today, though.
That's right. But now you can be more expansive, which is just as well, because this is Pratchett's longest book. So
Is it?
It's certainly the longest Discworld novel, and I don't think any of his other novels are longer than this one.
I must admit, I was rereading this time via the audiobook, which is my favourite rereading practice these days.
How long did that take?
It was a little bit surprising because I've been getting through a lot of them lately. And when I clicked onto it, it was somewhere between 13 and 14 hours instead of the usual 11 to 12. And it was a little bit, I'm going to have to make some extra time this month.
I thought you were going to say like 30 to 50.
No, it wasn't that bad, but it was definitely at least an hour longer than.
I was rereading it and I got up to page 152 and I was like, that's like a normal book, like a shorter one, but and it was not even a third of the way through the thing. I was like, what is happening?
Yeah.
Yeah. And when people say it's not really about football, it certainly doesn't seem it for a long time. But we'll get to that. We're getting ahead of ourselves.
Yeah, it's about candles, isn't it?
Well, yes.
It is largely about candles. Yeah. It's great.
But Tansy, I don't think we've said this because we don't often talk that far ahead about our schedule, mainly because we can't really predict it that far ahead. But you kind of bagged this one. Like, after you were on our first live episode, we asked you, look, we'd love to have you back for a full book. Is there one that you particularly like to talk about? And this is the one you mentioned. And I think at the time I said to you, great, I think we'll see you in 5 years.
We put you in the spreadsheet and here we are.
Yeah, here we are.
Yeah, I think I had 2 or 3 on my potential list, but a couple of them had already been dibs by other people.
Oh.
So, but I was the first one to put in for this one, and I was quite pleased to get it. But yeah.
Shall we begin with a reading of the blurb?
The very short blurb?
I'm going to read the original edition blurb, which is a little bit longer. Football has come to the ancient city of Ankh-Morpork. Not the old-fashioned, grubby pushing and shouting, but the new fast football with pointy hats for goalposts and balls that go glowing when you drop them. And now the Wizards of Unseen University must win a football match without using magic, so they're in the mood for trying everything else. The prospect of the big match draws in a likely lad with a wonderful talent for kicking a tin can, a maker of jolly good pies, a dim but beautiful young woman who might just turn out to be the greatest fashion model there has ever been, and the mysterious Mr. Nutt. No one knows anything much about Mr. Nutt, not even Mr. Nutt, which worries him too. As the match approaches, 4 lives are entangled and changed forever, because the thing about football, the important thing about football, is that it's not just about football. Here we go, here we go, here we go. I love that it ends with a football chant, which is one that I don't remember appearing in the actual book.
It does not, no.
But it's
implied.
It is implied.
Yeah.
I'm frustrated that they let the likely lad joke out like in the blurb. They just put that right out there.
Yeah.
Yeah, again, because it's not really like his name is likely, but I don't know that joke is made in the text.
Yeah, just leave it to us to enjoy, and when you figure out you have that like nice moment, it's not on the blurb. It's not on the blurb of my edition, so
No, but these collector's library ones that you and I have, Liz, the blurb is always just very, very short. And in fact, it's exactly 2 sentences from the original blurb, which they've glued together.
But it's because they know who's buying this, and it's people who do not need to be sold by the blurb.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
It's like it's pretty much it's the one with the football in it is all you need to know, and you can probably tell that from the cover. So
I would love if you did blurbs for all of them like that, though.
Yeah, equal rights. It's the first Granny Weatherwax one, but not really.
Ooh, controversial. I think it is, but we're not here to talk about equal rights.
No, we're here to talk about the Cabinet of Curiosities. Let's go.
Yeah. You know, we always struggle to get through the entire plot of any of these books, but this one is so long. I think a little bit like we said this about making money as well. It's fairly long, but when you think about what actually happens in terms of big plot stuff, there's not that many things, but there's so many little things and little character moments that happen along the way. It feels very full of stuff.
I think I should get the big question out of the way first, though. The span of this book. How many pies do you think were made collectively across it?
Well, lots, I think.
Yeah.
I tried to keep count, and I was like, no, I can't.
And it depends. Are you just talking about Glenda's pies, or are you talking about all the pies?
Let's say just Glenda's pies, because even
it's established that there are a lot of pies.
Yeah.
That happen at various times.
Glenda's and Juliet's, collectively.
Yeah, that's right.
A lot.
She has an integral pie. But crucially, Dibbler's not making pies.
No.
Like, no. He's risen above.
I just sort of, because I hadn't read this since it came out, so for about 15 years. And I knew that he would show up. I'm like, he can't not show up given the circumstances. Yeah. And then when he did and he wasn't selling pies, I'm like, I didn't remember this, but this makes sense.
Oh, he's selling the pirated shirts.
So good.
I should also say, I realized while reading this, I think this was my first time reading this book. I was so sure that I had, because it came out in 2009. I remember seeing it in stores. It was like, I was into Terry Pratchett by that stage, but I think it fell into that weird period where I couldn't afford the book, and the waiting list at the library was so long, it just got away from me. And I had just at some point assumed I'd read it, or I'd borrowed it and never got to finish it. And as I was reading, I was like, I don't know any of this. So it was a joy to have a new Pratchett for me.
That's exciting.
Yeah. But I was so sure I had. So every so often, like across this whole podcast, people are like, oh, it's like in that one. And so, that character. And I'd sort of be like, obviously I've just forgotten that, but I think, no, actually.
Yeah. And it's kind of the last one it is a wizard's book, and it's part of you can see it as part of the journey of all the wizard books. But it's really, I feel, the last of the books that's introducing new main characters.
Yeah.
Because those 4 characters mentioned in the blurb are all new. We haven't seen any of them before. They really only exist, I'm pretty sure, in this book, or they're only properly important in this book.
Yeah.
But after this, most the books that remain are, much closer sequels in the sense, there's another Moist book, there's another Vimes book, there's 2 Tiffany books, basically. One of which is sort of also a General Witches sequel. So this is like the last of the, I don't want to say original, I don't know, but it's fresh and it's new characters and it feels very complete.
Yeah, I agree with that. In some ways, it feels weird that it is such a wizard's book. In other ways, it doesn't. Like, it makes perfect sense that if you're going to bring football to Ankh-Morpork, there's going to be a university team. Like, if you're going to do a sporting book, it would seem weird not to bring the university into it because of the sort of intrinsically linked history of organized sport and universities. But at the same time, yeah, they're not the main characters, really. The major supporting characters, Ridcully and Ponder, I guess, are kind of main characters in this, but the other wizards very much just supporting characters.
Hicks is a big deal. I mean, he pops up a lot.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, and I was so pleased to see him again. That was great. But yeah.
I think there's actually a lot of character development for the wizards that you don't necessarily expect. Like, since pretty much Ridcully arrived, the wizards have been very set in the way, and things have changed, obviously, particularly Ponder Stibbons is probably the character who has changed and brought in the most, but a lot of them have remained pretty much the same. Whereas here we have some pretty substantial changes, particularly that the dean isn't the dean anymore. And in between books, he has left the university, which is kind of
huge.
And the bursar isn't there. Like, he's kind of gone off to quiet retirement somehow. And Ponder has meanwhile been amassing all this power. And so while Ridcully is still very much Ridcully, it's really interesting to me that suddenly this quite static community has had a lot of changes. And we're seeing those changes.
That's true.
And we get to see more of the behind the scenes of the Wizards and the university through all the servant characters, really, that we've seen since Equal Rights, which barely counts at all. You know, we had some kitchen scenes, and they acknowledged that the Wizards weren't the only one at the university. We've had the occasional, like, Mrs. Whitlow cameos and things like that, but this really digs deep into the university and what makes it work, and all the behind the scenes characters like the Knave of Candles.
Oh, the Candle Knave, Mr. Smeems, yeah.
Yeah.
What a jerk. He was great. He was a great character because I hated him so much.
Yeah. And immediately.
Yeah. And it's
good
you know, it's interesting to say that, because as you were saying that, I was like, yeah, no, you're right though, because I was also looking at the names, like, of who the senior faculty were, and most of the ones that we know barely turn up. Like, there's the meeting at the start that we'll talk about in a moment that kicks off the plot, where there's a couple of the familiar titles, because most of them we never learn their actual names. But then there's a couple of new ones, like Professor Hicks is there. There's a new professor who's got a slightly different title, although I couldn't quite tell, is this a completely new professor? Is this a new title for our existing one? Yeah, and in the dean being a massive absence, who's the one whose personality was always like the biggest and clearest one.
And then he comes back and he's Henry.
I know, it's so weird.
Yeah.
But great. It
feels like more of a wizard book in a lot of ways than a lot of the others that are classified as wizard books, but often it's like there's a lot of things happening and there's some wizards in the background, whereas this actually feels like a really, perhaps overdue, proper wizard book.
Yeah.
But again, they're not the main protagonists, any of them, but they are.
But they're deeply enmeshed.
We do get a lot of them.
Yeah. And the joy of their antics is good. It's like, it is just like waves of nostalgia as well. Like, every time they'd go out, or like when they'd get in a group and do a thing, or when they're all wearing trousers and laughing and pretending to be like the common guy or whatever. It's just like, it is like a hark back to the earlier books in a way that I had not realized I missed so much.
Yeah, things like moving pictures where they all like get in disguise and go over the wall and pretend to be honest burgers and all that. Yeah.
Yeah, some good fun there. Well, this is a hark back to that. And look, let's get into the plot a little bit. There's a classic Pratchett kind of setup scene where someone we've never met before and we'll never see again has something bad happen to them. In a departure from these scenes, nobody dies, so death's not there. It's a night watchman at the Ankh-Morpork Royal Museum, which prompts one of the longest footnotes Pratchett has ever written, possibly second only to the one in The Colour of Magic that introduces how the Discworld works, about the Royal in Ankh-Morpork Royal Museum. Very funny. And of course it has its own footnote. The footnote has a footnote.
And on page 1.
On page 1. So good. So good. But anyway, this night watchman who is hilariously afraid of everything and yet works as a guard after night in a museum is present when a mysterious shining figure, a woman, appears briefly, and there's an urn that is revealed, and this comes back later, of course. But that's sort of our weird something's afoot in Ankh-Morpork moment at the start of the book.
Something's a tonker.
Yeah. That's right. And then at the university we meet the candle knave, Smeems, who's going around lighting candles with one of his candle dribblers, because you can't have non-dribbly candles if you're a wizard, whose name is Mr. Nutt, who has been placed in the university, as we later learn, and is a goblin. And everyone's a bit like, goblin. Don't know about this.
Chickens, yeah.
They're jerks about it, basically. And he is very erudite. He's very well spoken. He's very intelligent. He's very good at everything that he does. He's a hyper competent character, which is always quite fun. There's a bit of nonsense that goes on introducing him in this scene where they're trying to light the old ancient candle, the Emperor, which has never gone out in inverted commas, as the wizards enact one of their traditions, the hunt for the megapode, the great megapode hunt. Now, look, I want to barrel through the plot a bit because there's so much of it, but I do want to pause just for the hunt the megapode thing, because I knew this was the book that it came from, and it is so beloved by fans. Like, if you ever go to a Discworld convention, someone will have a toy Megapode of some description that they've either made themselves or bought from another fan, because I don't think there's any official ones. I might be wrong about that. Listener, let me know. What's your favorite Megapode? The hashtag for this episode is Pratchat83. But when they hold it up, everyone points at it and has to go, "Ho,
the Megapode!"
and chase it, which is a delightful bit of nonsense. But it's such a short part of this book. Like, I think if it lasts more than 5 pages, I'd be surprised.
Yeah, I'd forgotten that it was in this book at all. In fact, I've been to 2 Discworld conventions, and the Megapode thing happened at both of them. It's always the same person at the Australian Discworld convention.
Yeah.
I think there's a whole thing about who owns it, and apparently it gets taken to different conventions.
It's travelled around the world, yeah.
But I didn't remember which book it was from or the context. It's just like, oh, this is a thing that everyone does. Okay. And so actually coming across it in this book was quite delightful. And I think it's interesting because it is a precursor to this idea of wizards and sport. And this is the closest that wizards get to sport, which is this hunt through the university. And of course, Rid Cully is a devout hunter of things generally. Like, he's the sportiest of all the wizards, and he enjoys the idea of them getting a bit of exercise, and they're running around after this thing. So yes, it's a nice little opening thing, but it is funny, isn't it, that it's just this one scene that has turned into this whole thing. But of course that's Discworld fandom for you, these tiny little details that become this huge thing.
Well, because his writing is so good, you can feel it stretching beyond the pages. You can be like, oh yeah, that is a tradition. You can imagine like where it's come from.
Absolutely. So, like, for instance, the goddess Anoia, who's like the contents of the kitchen cupboards. At the last Discworld convention we were at, there were 4 people who dressed up as this character, who I'm pretty sure only exists in a footnote in one of the books.
No, she comes back a few times. But
she's mentioned a couple of times, but like, she's not, let's face it, a significant character in the scheme of things.
She doesn't have her own book.
She's so captured the imagination.
Yeah.
And people love to create costumes because, she's a great character to dress up as.
She's unforgettable.
Now, obviously, yeah. Thank you, Liz.
There's a kettle in there too, don't worry.
Obviously, there's, I think you're right in that, a great part of that is the way Pratchett writes about these things. But is there also a big dimension of it that he's drawing on, this sort of broader cultural understanding of things like the crazy old traditions that universities have? Like, I'm also thinking about, I forget what it's called, but there's the bit in one of the earlier books where they do the thing with the keys. And there's this great long ceremony where one of them has to like pat their pockets. So, they've turned all the things you do when you've forgotten where your keys are into this sort of ancient ceremony that the university does all the time. And I think there's that kind of understanding of these fusty old institutions. And likewise with the Anoia, like everybody has shouted at their kitchen drawers because they're stuck with a whisk or something. And, he's tapping into that so deftly that it's not just the quality of the writing, it's also just his ability to spot something that he knows people will get.
Everything feels true.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. That thing about university rituals and things like that, I'm thinking of my big thing that happened to me in the last, probably still 12 to 18 months, was I discovered Wodehouse and properly read like a lot of Wodehouse.
Yeah.
Which feels like a key to unlocking pretty much every humorist writer in Britain of the 20th century. And particularly there's a lot of Pratchett stuff where I'm like drawing all these lines from one to the other. And yeah, one of the Wodehouse things about British culture is always these silly young university students who are always like, there's always some form of scavenger hunt, or they all have to like, steal a fish and a cat and then go back to halls.
Oh, yeah.
And all that sort of elaborate, almost prank culture.
Right, you've moved him up my list. He's been on there for a while.
Yeah, it's very interesting to read with a heavy knowledge of not just Pratchett, but Douglas Adams and like all the TV sitcoms, like the old comedy stuff of the 80s, all the Blackadder and your Ben Elton stuff. And yeah, just basically all the comedy written by people who went to university.
Yeah.
There's a line between Wodehouse and, pretty much every aristocratic character he writes, like the older ones, all the dukes and the earls and that, they're all Pratchett's wizards. Yeah. Like, they're basically the same guy.
Yeah.
This sort of like slightly baffled, befuddled, intellectually distracted older men who just want to be left alone to pot their geraniums.
And enjoy a brandy now and then and a cigar.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly.
There's always making fun of the elite, but there's an awful lot of making fun of those in power. The wizards, have this enormous power, but they're also a bunch of grumpy old men who would rather be in their dressing gowns, and may in fact be in their dressing gowns, let's face it.
Yes. And not all of them so old. I mean, Ponder is the young'un of the group. And I think this is, you're saying it's an interesting evolution for the wizards, and Ponder, I think, is at the heart of this, because one of the catalysts for this book is that he has accumulated all these different jobs at the university. Basically, any job that requires someone to actually do something to make the university function, he has ended up with. And that's partly because the dean has left. He's been offered the post of Arch-Chancellor at Brazeneck College in Pseudopolis, an organization that had previously been mentioned, but we didn't really know anything about them. And now it turns out that they have branched out into teaching wizards as well as the other things they teach there. So they need an Arch-Chancellor, and they've offered him a job, which he's taken. So he's gone to Pseudopolis, and Ridcully is very pissed off about this in that classic city way where he turns to talk to the dean and he's not there, and it sends him off the handle. So that's great. And then Ponder's also taken on all these other jobs because they keep finding people are no longer in them. For example, the Master of Traditions, who it turns out has been dead for 200 years. And there's a great gag where he suggests, we could use some new traditions, perhaps the tradition of checking in on the Master of Traditions, which I thought was delightful.
I mean, how long had the previous Master of Traditions been dead before they discovered it? Like, is that in itself a tradition?
Maybe.
Maybe it is now. It's interesting too, because like when Ridcully realizes that Ponder has, as he discreetly points out, like enough votes that he can basically accomplish anything he wants in the university at any time. He says, how did you amass all this power? And Ponder basically says, I think of it as responsibilities. In other words, everybody has been so busy offloading their responsibilities on the one young guy in the office who will agree to do it, the one who turns up and takes all the jobs, that they've actually lost their power, which is fascinating because all we've been told about the wizards right from the start of the series is how obsessed they are with power and how much they all want to kind of off each other and rise in the ranks. And in fact, once Ridcully arrived, that all sort of stopped.
Yeah.
And possibly because he kept them busy hunting megapodes and the like and running around in circles. So they never actually managed to assassinate him. But they've all just got really comfy. And now Ponder pretty much is both exhausted, overworked, running the school, but he also kind of rules it.
But secretly and kind of quietly and just sort of getting things done. I mean,
he only pointed it out when he had to.
Yeah, there's this great bit in there also that says, it's well known in organizations that if you want something done, you give it to someone who's already very busy. Although that has resulted in a lot of homicides, as the joke goes in the book. But that's Ponder. He's doing everything, and I think there's a real feeling amongst fans, and I think maybe we've discussed this on the podcast before, that Ridcully really is kind of grooming him to be the next Arch-Chancellor. I mean, that makes perfect sense. But in this book, I don't know if that's text, because he never sort of responds to Ponder's sort of accumulation of titles in a way that suggests he's very pleased about it. He's not displeased about it, but he's not like, yes, good work. Excellent. This is what I want to happen.
It feels like if he has been, it's been subconsciously, and he's quite surprised to discover that he's been doing this.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. And it's interesting when you consider all the way back when we first met Ponder, he was the one who got in on a technicality because he got the wrong exam paper that was supposed to go to Victor in moving pictures. He was a very stressed young student.
But very gifted, as a sort of...
intimidated by wizards. And now he's had to spend his whole life being surrounded by these older wizards telling him what to do. And he's been quietly grooming himself for the position of Arch-Chancellor, let's face it.
But that means he's always been aside as well. Like, he's not the sort of same pathway that everyone's on. So that's probably why because other people could have done what he's doing. He has chosen to take on these responsibilities and do them well, because he could have amassed these titles and done nothing with them, as a lot of the others do. But I think that just shows that he's come from somewhere else and is doing things differently. And that has that's a good consistency throughout his storyline.
Yeah. And he occupies a sort of interesting position as like a nerd amongst nerds. Like he's the one who was, there's some great flashbacks and moments of him like later on where he remembers being bullied as a kid. And then he also remembers the day that, you know, like his magical power awakened and I can't remember what he did to one of his bullies, but there's a great description of it where he's like, oh, this isn't going to happen to me anymore because I'm a bloody wizard. Like, which was kind of cool. Yet at the same time, you know, throughout the Wizard's books, he's kind of occupied that position of the nerd who knows what he's doing, but isn't really taken seriously by the people in charge. And now that worm has turned, so to speak. And another thing that's turned are the pages of the Book of Traditions at the university because while they only do the hunt for the megapode once every century, Ponder sort of is trying to make sure that they're back on track with all the traditions. But the pages of the book turn themselves and reveal to him a tradition that they have not been keeping on top of, which is that according to the rules of a bequest given to the university, which is quite a lot of money, in fact, it accounts for something like 87% of the university's food budget, they have to put forward a team for Poor Boys Fun, or Poor Boys Funny, as it is spelled in the oldie English of the book, at least once every 20 years, or that bequest is taken away from the university. And this sends them into a bit of a panic because they do not want to go without 4 cheese boards in the middle of the night. So they need a football team is what it comes down to. And this is something they haven't done for probably, I think they said at least about 20 years, which gives us a nice sort of time frame for what's happened to football. Because we know that football has existed in some form in the Discworld. It's been mentioned in a couple of previous books, and we'll get to a couple of listener questions about that at the end. But it has kind of devolved into this vicious street gang warfare kind of a game rather than, you know, an organized sporting thing. So the university and the guilds kind of divorced themselves from it, and it has now become a thing of the people.
And it has been banned. Like, it is officially banned by the city at the moment.
That's true.
So the games that are happening are actually illegal.
Yeah, but the ban is not particularly enforced, even though it does exist.
No.
Yes.
It's a bit like Backstreet Drag Race. It's like Fast and the Furious stuff happening, you know. It's all these Backstreet Racing or whatever.
Yeah.
And I love that line about, like, people get killed, and that's fine because that happens, but they're damaging property, and that cannot be tolerated.
Yeah. In the terms of the history of football in England, we're in the late 80s.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and I think, and this is interesting because, like, the fiction that I'm aware of, like, that informs my understanding of British football is kind of from that 80s period. Like, one of the most influential things on my understanding of football is British comedy, and in particular, one of the very last episodes of The Goodies. And I see a lot of the same gags really in here, but that was like 1980. And then this is, like you're saying, Tansy, it's harkening back to that same era of British football.
The history of football in England was like the late 80s, early 90s was when it all came to a crunch, but it had absolutely like the violence of the supporters and the rough aspect of it was kind of a big part of the story. And ultimately, how the game solved the problem was deeply problematic because it was gentrification. Basically, they made it more expensive to go to games. They put it in so that you could only be in the seating and not the general scrum standing area, which was always the cheaper option. And as, you know, more and more money has been poured into the Premier League, more and more, you know, billionaire ownerships of teams and all that sort of thing, actually having a season ticket is, I think it's pretty much the equivalent price of a small car these days. So it kind of hasn't solved the problem in a sense, in that it basically pushed it out of an ordinary person's experience. But there was a lot of bloodshed happening. So yeah, and a lot of my understanding from this actually comes from the Nick Hornby book, Fever Pitch. It's all about his childhood and his relationship with his dad and following a football team that never wins, and what that does to your psyche. But also it's about the community and about the fans and the following. And that's such a huge part. I think it's really interesting that this book that's about sport, so much of it is actually, even though it's about a game and about playing the game, it is a lot more about the fandom and the supporters and that culture far more than it is the literal game. And in fact, the game itself has such few stakes. Like at first, the whole thing of like they need a football team. It's actually a really popular trope in underdog movies, that idea of you've got to put a sports team together, but it doesn't even matter if you win, you've just got to do it. I actually read a great graphic novel called Bunt recently by Ngozi Okazu, who's the same writer of Check Please, which is an excellent gay hockey comic. But Bunt is about an arts college, like a fine arts college, and there's this magic scholarship that will activate if they can put together a softball team, and all they have to do is play, like, a game. They don't have to win, but just getting all these artists and drama kids together to play sport is just so joyous. And I see a lot of, reflections to what's happening here, because about people who are not naturally sporting people, like the Wizards, the bunch of elderly nerds, but they don't have to win. They just need to have a team. It's only at the turning point of the plot later on when Rid Cully basically gets in his head about it and challenges the dean to a bet over the hat, the Arch-Chancellor's hat, that the stakes are raised. Not for everybody else. Everybody else is still playing for the cheese trolley.
Well, yes.
But for Rid Cully, the stakes get upped and upped.
They do.
To the point that it actually matters whether he wins or not.
Well, and then there's the other reason why it matters is when we get to the game, they kind of realize that if this goes badly, this could actually undermine the patrician to the point where it's no longer tenable for him to rule the city, and that could lead to chaos and anarchy, So I think it builds that tension quite nicely. But you're right, at the start, it doesn't feel like the stakes are massive, except for comedically massive. It's that classic comedy device of the stakes are hugely important to the characters, but from an outsider's perspective, the stakes are nothing,
Yeah. And there's that fascinating scene where Rid Cully basically reluctantly goes to see Vetinari, effectively to try and get permission for them to set up a team and to play the sport, even though he doesn't really want to, only to realise or discover that Vetinari, of course, is one step ahead of him and has already been working on this. He wants to civilise the game. He wants to make the game legal again, but make it more safe. And this whole thing with the sudden reveal of the urn is part of that conspiratorial plot to try and make it, I guess, civilize the sport. I guess the idea of if the Wizard's doing it, it can't be that interesting.
Well, I think that's more that they're official, and they're seen as quote unquote civilized. But I read that not as he was ahead of Rid Cully, but that he too has been infected by whatever it is that's bringing football to Ankh-Morpork.
Because that's interesting.
The way they have that conversation, it felt like we see it from Rid Cully's point of view, where he's like,
that's true.
Vetinari wants to do this anyway. I'm going to get away with this pretty easily, but this seems fishy. But they never have the conversation where it's clear, and often you get a payoff like that with Vetinari, where, he has a conversation with Drumknot or something and reveals a little bit of his machinations.
But he has that a little bit beforehand, but still.
Yeah.
Certainly get the sense they both come away with what they want from the meeting.
Yes.
And Rid Cully is the one we see that is deeply suspicious about it.
Yes, indeed. And it's what something else wants, which we'll get back to towards the end of the book. But you mentioned that fans, and of course that's who our main characters are, our three football fans, apart from Mr. Nutt, who becomes a football fan but does not start out as one.
Yeah.
A football nut.
Oh, true.
So Mr. Nutt's doing his candle dribbling, and he works technically not directly for Mr. Smeems, the candle knave, but instead for Trev Likely, who is a likely lad who supposedly runs the candle dipping vat. But really he's bunking off to watch the football and letting Mr. Nutt do all the work with his wind-up candle dribbling device.
Yeah. In fact, it's explained that Mr. Nutt could actually do all the work very clearly, but it was quietly pointed out to him, I think by Trev at one point, that he actually had to hold back, otherwise all the other candle dribblers would get fired, basically, because he could just be it all. So they've solved that problem. So he basically does the dribbling for like 2 hours a day, and then he goes off and does other things in the middle of the night. And but they become friends, which is really lovely. Like, they've worked together for some time, but we actually see them form a pretty good friendship, largely through Trev taking Nutt to the football.
Yeah.
But it never feels like Trev is using Nutt. Like, I was worried initially that was the dynamic, that he's like, oh, I can go do my... But it's because, like, they're each getting what they want, but, like, it's not because of anything sort of nefarious. It just sort of... It works out. So I felt good about their relationship from the beginning after an initial sort of, like, is it going to meet? No, it's good.
And it's interesting because it is reflected in the relationship between our other characters, Glenda and Juliet, who, again, we have the very competent person who runs the night kitchen and her best friend who's kind of a bit dim and very pretty and gets away with a lot, but also a complete skiver when it comes to the work. But it's never seen as a really, like, it's not like she means to.
No.
She just gets caught up in her head. And also Glenda is one of those people who solves the problem before it becomes a problem. So she's basically been walking behind Juliet, tidying up after her entire life, which has probably not actually been that good for either of them.
No.
And part of her arc in the book is realizing that she's been complicit in the unbalance in this friendship.
Yeah, and her arc in this book is so great. I love
it. Really is
beautifully handled, like just delicately, like just throughout. It's
And actually, speaking of things that are delicately handled in this, you have a character who is explicitly described as not being as attractive as another character. And there are some very there are a few unflattering kind of descriptions of Glenda in the book, but they're not that awful.
Not compared to, let's say, the heights of the Agnes.
Exactly.
I kept calling her Agnes in my mind from time to time, though, because like you just worry about those descriptions. But no, they're not as.
Yeah. I also found that there's a transition here where anytime someone describes her that way, most of that time it's a character saying it rather than it being in the narrator's voice. Whereas in previous books, the fat jokes were unrelenting and they were in the narration as well as from the characters.
And sometimes quite, not that they're ever really appropriate, but yeah, definitely inappropriate. And in this case, this is the thing about jokes that make fun of people, especially people's physique. Actually, whether they come across as painful or reasonably okay to read often depends on the reaction of the person being joked about. And it shouldn't necessarily be the case, but that is often the difference between having a laugh and bullying.
Yeah.
But in Glenda's case, it's not something that especially matters to her. Like, she doesn't seem particularly bothered about either her shape or her appearance. It's not something that's that important to her. And in fact, the fact that Juliet is so pretty is something that constantly worries Glenda. And that's partly they fall into this weird relationship where Glenda is kind of accidentally mumming her best friend and has been for a long time. But there's this sense where actually the prettiness of Juliet is more hazardous potentially. And I think Glenda, and it's something that actually I think a lot of women would find, you know, a lot of empathy with. Glenda finds that her own not being seen as that sort of very pretty, desirable woman is a layer of protection for her. It's something, because she doesn't seem especially, it's interesting, she reads all the romantic books and things like that. We don't see her particularly craving romance. She's not somebody who would feel like her life was not complete if she didn't get married and things like that. Like, her main complaint about the romance books is that they don't have enough cooking in them.
Yes.
Adore.
But she does keep reading them.
She does keep reading them, and she enjoys this sort of thing, but there isn't this sense where she doesn't seem to feel that she's lacking because she's just so confident in her capabilities and her strengths.
Yeah, she doesn't.
Yeah, I don't know.
She's a strong, independent woman who doesn't need no man. But, like, there's the whole thing, like, because there's that thread of, like, Trev being like, I was interested in, like, as in, obviously he's
that's
different.
the other thing. She is desirable.
Yeah.
Trev was interested in her.
And she's like, no, not a bar of that. I'm not interested.
Yeah.
So she's got...
She's choosy.
Yeah. And she's
But
happy.
I think it is really nice to show, especially because there is this huge emphasis on how both beautiful but also very traditionally feminine beautiful that Juliet is.
Yeah.
I think it's great that, like, Glenda was the previous woman that Trev was interested in. So, which does suggest that he's not somebody where beauty is the only thing that he's actually interested in.
Yeah.
Or traditional, you know, pretty slim blonde beauty.
Yeah, she was looking for the right guy who, like...
It actually makes you feel better about him in some ways, that he's actually not massively shallow.
Yeah.
He just sort of likes people, and he likes Glenda. Glenda's great, and he sees that.
Yeah.
And she's 100% not interested in him.
Yeah.
Which is also great.
There's definitely a recurring joke, though, that Glenda is disappointed at how little people are interested in her. Like, there's, you know, there's a couple of times when people want a kiss from Juliet and she says, well, I could give you a kiss. And they're like, I'm not interested. And she's obviously a bit miffed.
Yeah.
And there's also, the scene I remember is when she's at the football match at the end and she needs to get to the pitch and she gets handed down and people are touching her. And there's a line about how she's glad she wore her most I think, impenetrable pants or something.
Yeah.
But then there's a footnote that says, but she was kind of disappointed later on when she realized that actually no one had tried anything. And you're like, okay.
But it feels like it's a small wistfulness and not like a great tragedy in her life.
Fair. Yeah.
Like it's one of those things where actually if one of them did pinch her bum while she was crowd surfing, she would have thumped him and be really cross about it.
She puts out an energy that she's like, if you mess with me, you're gonna get messed with back. Like she's got to. That's why she has to punch up Juliet's guys for her as well.
It is explored really well with both of them is the invisibility of not being pretty. And they do look at the pretty privilege and all that sort of thing as well. But Glenda has sort of entered an invisibility that is normally reserved for women once they hit 40.
Yeah.
You know, that sense. And she kind of has come into hers early. The fact that people assume that she's Juliet's mother, not necessarily because she looks older than her, but because of how she behaves. That there's a lot of complex stuff going on there, but it is all, I found it deeply interesting.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of Glenda's thing is also, like, as she battles throughout the book, is she's personified her mother too much too soon, and that's something she's battling against as well. So that is probably also part of the whole thing where she's having, like, I'm wearing my most impenetrable outfit, but also I wish someone would pinch me on the bum. There's like a bit of, like, maybe I should be young and feckless and all of this, but also that's nonsense. Like, there's in her there are two wolves, and one of them is her mother.
Yeah, in the same way that Agnes had her, like, bitchy mean girl inside her head, Glenda has her mother inside her head a little bit too ingrained, and so she's actually made such sensible decisions that she's forgotten how to, like, do anything fun or reckless. And, of course,
without a plan that's 5 steps visible from, like, where she is.
Yeah. But I do like that we see Glenda both from other points of view and from hers, and the fact that both Nut and Trev that think that she's great. Nut doesn't seem to, like, he's certainly very attracted to her. He doesn't seem necessarily, he particularly focuses on her kindness and her personality and all that sort of thing, which is lovely because, let's face it, she's actually not that kind to him when they meet. She becomes kind.
Yeah.
I would love her and the Lady Sybil side quest book. That would just be amazing.
Yeah.
The two of them teaming up.
Like, either they'd be best of friends or the worst of nemesis.
Wow. Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, speaking of Lady Sybil, like, that's a very good example of a large romantic heroine whose body is written in a way that is really quite upsetting, even in the process of being a romantic figure. And we don't get that here. So it's like, they're always the fat jokes. And Wodehouse, by the way, getting back to him, also appalling with the fat phobia. But it does feel like it's become kinder and less, I don't know, maybe more nuanced.
There's no reveling in descriptions in a disgusting way in the same way that there were in earlier books.
And hey, at least he's still putting fat women in his books. And let's face it, there are very few fantasy authors who do.
Yeah. Although, you know, she's very rarely actually directly described as fat. I think someone says it incidentally, like once. It does happen once. I think Trev, when he first tells Nut about her, says there's this fat girl up in the kitchens who makes the best food you've ever tasted. And, like, it's just a very matter of fact. Like, it's not an insult.
But then what somebody would describe as fat is another thing.
Well,
you know?
Exactly.
We get Nut's amazing description of a certain area of her anatomy, which takes several pages for her to be like, am I offended? I have to go to the library.
She does have a mighty bosom. Though, to be fair, I'm pretty sure a lot of that is also come via Trev, because you got the impression that, because Trev had told him that was something to sort of talk about. That, no, I take back what I said about being physically attracted.
Her fecundity.
Yeah. That's actually a lovely touch about Glenda too, is her, I think there's a lot of words she doesn't understand, but she's been reading books. And that's why I think one of the things, again, she's such a sympathetic character to me. The fact that she knows all these words from books, but she doesn't 100% know their meaning, only some of their context. And there are several points in the book where she picks up on some.
Boudoir.
And I think she's able to, like, boudoir and things like that. And she's able to, like, expand her knowledge a bit.
That was great. I really loved that.
You literally see her world expanding, like, as she, like, lets herself do some different things out of her routine. And that's 3 words. And I thought that was, like, beautifully done.
And a lovely respect for romance novels as well.
Yeah.
Because the romance novels are, like, clearly there is this aspect of they're a bit trashy, but they're also something that's really important to her. And it's something that, is not denigrated within the story.
It's the reason people love them.
In fact, it is shown to be something that has helped her and helps her sort of rise above, which is an overall theme of the book, really. It's about characters rising up out of their circumstances to improve their life. That's something that all 4 of the main young characters have in common.
Yeah.
Is that the case with Trev, or is he just like living up to the thing that he'd suppressed?
Well, because the thing about Trev is, I mean, they're all very poor for a start. They come from very kind of like reasonably humble origins. And Trev has come from quite a tragic background in that his father was the football hero of the backstreets who got, like, was it 2 goals in his lifetime?
4.
Legend.
4 in one match was the record.
But he died in the game. And so Trev has basically been having to look after his family. He promised his poor old mum, that's the whole thing, if he would never play football. And I think one of the things that's really emphasised in the book is the way that football has traditionally been one of those ways in which people from very poor working class backgrounds, certainly in Britain, can rise up to a dream life.
Yeah.
Which is why it's really interesting that Juliet's storyline is about going into modelling, because that's the other one. Those are the two, like, especially in like the 80s and 90s. I think these days it's perhaps more influencer culture. But back in the day, the football and the model are very much the fantasy thing of how an ordinary person might, it's their version of the Cinderella story, might be whisked into fame and fortune and be able to step up out of their circumstances. So there are a lot of young men, obviously it's men because women are still not getting paid properly to play sport, or it's only just starting to happen. But young men for whom being accepted to a training program or getting in with one of the clubs is like their way out of poverty.
Yeah.
And I think Trev represents that.
Yeah. Which is not an option at the start of this story, but it becomes so by the end. I just want to talk a bit more about Juliet, actually, because I think she's sort of a flip side to the fatphobic kind of way Pratchett has written about women in the past.
Yeah.
She's the kind of opposite of that, where the way that I didn't remember this aspect of the book, but I found the way that he wrote about her where, she's written as so beautiful that men cannot help the way that they feel or behave around her.
Yeah.
Which is problematic in its own way. It's not a great way to write about women, but she has that effect even on the wizards, which is kind of extraordinary. Yeah. And I think that the book kind of forgets about that after a while, which was quite good.
Well, I disagree.
No, I think it continues.
Because she's so magnetic. That's why she's such a compelling model. When she finally gets the spotlight, she's always been something about her that's magnetic, that when she finally gets a platform, the world gets to see it. That's why she gets several front covers being like, first of all, this amazing woman is showing off dwarf chainmail, and then we don't know who she is, and people are so fascinated with her because she has a magnetism that probably is beyond her beauty as well. She's beautiful, but there's also something, and I think he's trying to get into what's magnetic about someone beyond just superficial beauty that makes them a supermodel.
Iconic.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, when I say the book forgets about it, I don't mean that she suddenly loses that ability, but more that it only becomes a thing in her subplot of being a model, and a couple of times where she uses her charms to help them get past obstacles. But when it starts, she doesn't even turn up in that first scene. Glenda turns up instead because Juliet's still at the football because the old games stop until 3 a.m. sometimes. I don't know. It just felt like I was worried it was going to go down a road where something would feel off and kind of gross. But then, when she gets to the fashion show and they explain what they really want her to do and how she's got this natural talent for doing it, it felt more like a talent rather than, some sort of, it's built into you. And that felt much better than the way it seemed to me.
Yeah, absolutely. 100%. It's not just her beauty. It is her way. And I think it's interpreted as beauty because it's her very presence.
Yeah.
But it's really, really interesting. I think the respect that's given to modelling in this story is so surprising. I mean, okay, partly it's there because of the way that modelling and football, I think, are hand in hand in British culture. There's the wags, there's the, the footballers have the pretty girlfriends. That's the whole thing. But also the pretty girlfriends become an industry into themselves sometimes and become in many cases lifting the fame of the boyfriend. I mean, we see what happens now with, Taylor Swift and
yes,
Travis, what's his face?
I couldn't stop imagining that too.
And that's been fascinating because it's two fandoms just really angry about each other, particularly like the football fans just continuing to be furious that the filming of the game sometimes cuts to this like celebrity person watching the game and just being so angry about it. And both fandoms can't really understand the level of fame and importance that the respective significant others of the person it's so interesting. And of course, I'm assuming Posh and Bex was a really big,
for sure,
element to that too. And that's the thing about Victoria Beckham. She wasn't just a pop star. She wasn't just a model. She created an industry around herself. She became an entrepreneur.
They're just so savvy. Like, they're smart
and
businesswomen.
You see that with a lot of these women. And there's a lot of drama around them, that sort of thing too. But no, considering the way that beautiful women have been written in the past in the Discworld books, and I think particularly the Agnes-Christine dynamic, but there have been other examples as well. I think it's fascinating the respect given to Juliet, and that ultimately, as well, because she's not that bright. So she's not that smart, and she's incredibly beautiful.
Yeah.
And yet her character is so interesting. And in fact, Trev, yes, he's hit over the head by how pretty she is, but he doesn't fall in love with her because of that. He falls in love with her because she yells at him about football.
Yeah.
Like the first time she opens her mouth and he realizes, she's basically slagging him off for wearing his football colours because she supports a different team.
Support different teams,
and she cares so much, and she basically gives him all that, and then she storms off, and he's just like, "Who is this amazing woman?" It's lovely. And it has a little Romeo and Juliet thing about it.
Yeah, although that doesn't really go anywhere. It kind of feels like that's going to be a thing, and it's not.
They bring it back briefly in a theatre production, and I'm like, just let it be. You didn't have to call her Juliet. It's fine.
It seems like it has the potential for that, but really they both really care about football.
Yeah.
And that's more important than which team it is.
Yeah.
But it does bring up this whole theme that we see early on about the community of fandom and the faces. Trevor Likely is a face, which means he turns up to the games and people see him turn up to the games and people watch the way he watches football.
Yeah.
Which is so interesting. And the fact that he doesn't play himself.
Well, it's because they can't see the game either, right? Like, that's a big part of this version of football, this sort of old school backstreets football. There's no stadiums. There's no equivalent to it being televised. So if you go to a game, they're in the shove, which is this mass of people around the pitch. And indeed, after their first meeting in the kitchen, Juliet and Trev, who actually have seen each other at the game earlier that night, but then when they see each other in the kitchen, they're like, "You!" And that's when they have their sort of exchange. And they realize they like each other. But, this is where we get from that to we're going to go to a game. And everyone goes to the game. Like the university faculty are like, well, if we're going to play this game and learn about it, we better go watch a game. And at the same time, Trev's like, it's time to go to a game. Hey, Nut, you should come with me to this game. We'll dress you up.
He's trying to teach you how to people.
Yeah, we'll teach you how to people. And so they all go and they go into the shove. And it's just this mass of people who mostly cannot see what's going on. They just sort of hear what's happening from the people who can see what's going on. And, it's called the shove because you do shove each other around. Like, it's like a mosh pit kind of deal, right?
Sounds terrible.
Yeah. And the darker side of it is that in real football, people have literally died. Yeah. And in fact, they do in the Discworld too, but it's funnier.
Yeah. And this is where we find out a bit more about sort of Nut's physical capabilities. I keep calling him Nut. His official name in the book is Mr. Nut, but he doesn't ever get given a first name. So I found that was kind of weird. And I don't know how I felt about that.
Just because call him Nut.
I also liked that, as he's saying, like, Trev starts out quite friendly with him. He's not trying to take advantage of him. He is genuinely trying to help him, it seems. Although he's also, trying to, get him to help him as too. But the first few times he's talking to him, he calls him Gobbo, which is obviously like a bit of a off-color nickname for a goblin. But that stops reasonably quickly, and he instead just calls him mate or Mr. Nut or Nut, which I was appreciative of. But what happens at the game is they tell Nut, what we do is we shove our way to the front. He's incredibly strong, so he shoves not just them, but also like a stall all the way to the front to the edge of the game, which means they're close enough to the pitch that Juliet almost gets flattened by the ball, but Trev saves her. And the ball is like a bit of wood dressed up with rags and stuff. It's not like a traditional modern football. So it would have been quite deadly probably. But Nut catches it and is like, what, this is the ball? What's the deal? And Glenda's
Where
like,
should it go?
That's the goal. The post is the goal over there. And what you're supposed to do is hit it with the ball. And he goes, oh, well, that's easy. And he chucks the ball at it from like the opposite end of the pitch. Not just hits it, but disintegrates it. And that kind of ends the match. And everyone sort of goes, what just happened? And there's all these rumors flying around. And Trev's like, we got to get out of here. This is going to be trouble for us.
The man in a black hat went that way and it was him.
Yeah. And they leave. They kind of get separated. So Glenda and Juliet head back to the kitchens. Juliet having given Trev a little
favor
badge. Yeah, favor from her team, which is kind of deadly if he gets caught carrying it. Great little
Why was
bit.
she carrying it? Yeah.
Well, because it's her team.
Yeah, but like, is it something she'd normally be wearing? It seemed like it was in her pocket.
Well, I think so, but I think she's giving it to him as kind of, because you remember she gives it to him and then she turns her back on him. And I think it's like a test. It's like, how serious are you about me? Are you going to carry my football team's thing? That's what it felt like to me. It was a bit like, I'm going to give you something that's important to me, but also it's a test to see if you actually like me or if you're going to stick to the rules. That's how I felt about it, which I thought was quite clever on her behalf in a way.
Well, she's sharp in unexpected ways, as comes out throughout the book.
It turns out that she is a lot smarter about things than people have been assuming for a long time.
Yeah.
Just because she coasts through life.
Yeah, because we see her through her friend's lens throughout.
Yeah.
And as her friend comes to realize there's actually more to her than we do as well. So I think...
Yeah.
There's that great line where Glenda realizes, and this is kind of what you were saying earlier, that, you know, whenever Juliet had a problem, Glenda solved it by taking the problem away from her rather than teaching her how to solve it. So she's never had a chance to show what she's good at or what she understands. And I thought it was quite subtle. Like, I don't think Pratchett hits you over the head with, well, nobody's stupid about everything. It's just a matter of factly the way that she's written. And I kind of really liked that.
And she has a lot of layers. We learn so much about her. Like, she comes from this very masculine family of football fans in which she is the least important member because she's the girl.
Yeah.
Her dad is a big face in the game. Her brothers are all very kind of like big and athletic and violent.
And thugs. Really?
Yeah. And Juliet spends as much time as possible actually away from them because she's not. And so really Glenda has parented her and has sort of provided a safe space for her in the kitchen, which is Glenda's happy place. But for Juliet, it's just a job.
Yeah, and she's sitting in the corner reading Bubble magazine.
Yeah, and dreaming of bigger things. And she spots this fashion trend of dwarf armor and the fact that dwarf ladies are looking for something a bit more glamorous. And Juliet becomes fascinated by this, by the fashion generally and the rise of dwarf fashion, and it's something she knows a lot about. And it's something that is trivialized by other people, and this whole thing, again, the glossy magazines and the respect that's given to the fashion industry just blows my mind in a fantasy novel or in a comedy novel, you know? Yeah, and so Juliet finds her dream, which is to put on a beard and model the new micro-male, which doesn't chafe. And I love that undercutting. Like, yes, it's about a beautiful woman becoming a supermodel, but the fact that she wears a beard and there's never really a joke about it.
No,
it's not played up in a kind of like hilarious cross-dressing way because she's wearing a lady's beard. And it's just, and if anything, it makes her more beautiful.
Yeah.
But there is that great nod to the unattainable beauty standards set to you by magazines and modeling, though, because, like, these dwarf ladies are looking to this human woman who is beautiful beyond even human standards to model their clothes. So you can never look like her in those, but that is who they're choosing to model them.
Yeah.
And also because she's not that tall for a human, but she's quite tall for a dwarf. So she's basically their version of Elle Macpherson.
Yeah.
She might be like 5'2".
But you can never get to that. And I like that quiet nod without beating you over the head with it.
Yeah.
But also the fact that she is special. Like when she turns up doing the modelling and everybody kind of like goes a bit insane about her. It's that it's not like they could pull any young girl off the street and do this with them. And there is something really special about her. And there's something valuable in her natural talent for wearing dwarf armor, you know?
Yeah.
And again, it's seen as a proper job that's actually quite a difficult thing to do unless you are the person that's born to do it. Like, there are some people who just have this talent, and she does, and it works for her, and they want her, like these very terribly important fashionista people.
Yeah. Now, I don't want us to get too ahead of ourselves, though, with all of this talk about fashion shows and modelling, because that is such an important part of the plot, but we haven't got there yet. And where we are now is still leaving the football game. And Juliet and Glenda would go back to the university
to sort out their alibis.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Alibis.
Alibis. Very good. Very good. But Trev and Nut are heading off separately, and they are waylaid by a bunch of, well, first of all,
not likely lads.
Two of Juliet's brothers,
yeah,
who are big thugs in the game. Her father is actually the captain of one of the teams, the team that she supports. But yeah, her brothers I don't think are players, but they are football hooligans in the full sense of the term.
Yeah. Now, Trev is Dolly Sisters, but what is the other team?
Dimwell.
Dimwell. Okay, yeah.
Dimwell Old Pals, they're called.
Yeah.
We don't get heaps of football team names in this book, but we do get a few, and some of them are pearlers. They're great.
Yeah. You'll say the Dolly Sisters thing, there's a lovely little discussion of masculinity around the pink hat with Nut and Trev.
Yeah, that was great.
Yeah, it's beautiful because it's the pink and yellow. And I don't think they say what the Dimwell colours are.
I think they do get mentioned. I think it might be blue and white or something like that. I can't remember for sure now. Yeah. But it's, they are mentioned. But yeah, the
something
pink
more subdued.
Hello is glorious.
I want a Dolly Sisters hat.
Why? It's surely that someone must have made some. There must be a fan out there knitting them. I mean, if you can get I don't know, listener, if you know of a great, Dolly Sisters club hat, please let us know. I think we'd all appreciate that, or a scarf.
Yeah.
But look, they get waylaid by these football fans who are annoyed. They think that Nut and Trev either have something to do with what happened, or they're at least very suspicious of them.
Which
Trev
is fair.
Yeah, which is fair.
Because they literally are correct.
Yeah, they are correct. But Trev's trying to talk them down, and it's going fairly well until Nut thinks, I can help with this. And he says something about, this situation's quite like this experiment from the old Uberwaldian scientist with the rats in a cage. And one of them takes exception to this and hits him so hard that he's dead. That's quite full on. Everybody scarpers, and the watch turns up. Trev goes back to the watch house. He gets interviewed by Angua. They send Nut to the hospital and Dr. Lorne. But the watchmen who are there are like, he's dead. Like, there's nothing they can do for him. But then he does wake up, or comes back to life. He has a little interlude where he speaks to Death. Death says, you're not going to remember this, but it's not your time yet. And he wakes up. And we don't find out how he does this until much later. And it's sort of explained a little sort of aside. One of the things they did when they made us orcs, because he's an orc. If you didn't know the end of the book, it's spoiler.
Awkward.
But we're doing this a bit out of order, so you're just going to find out now.
You expect spoilers if you listen to a thing about the whole book.
You would hope so, yeah.
Not chronological spoilers.
No.
We usually do try to avoid that.
And the winner of the football game, no.
But we're all over the place today, and that's appropriate because there's so much happens. But they put in a thing they call it the little brother, which is like some sort of, he doesn't really say what it is, but it's like an extra organ or maybe some like microbes or something, which is fun. And it basically can sort of repair him from pretty much anything, including more or less death.
He self-egors.
Yeah, he self-egors.
Oh, it's like midichlorians, isn't it?
Maybe.
He's like a Klingon or like orcs from the Warhammer universe, which aren't animals. They're like colonies of fungus in humanoid shape. But yeah, it's fun. I like that it's addressed, but not in a way that really answers the question.
I mean, meanwhile, Trev is inconsolable. Like, he's devastated. Yeah. And it's actually a really important thing for Trev, because after this, you see him questioning a lot more about his life, and particularly his other friends.
Yeah.
He immediately gets in a huge fight with like one of the most powerful ones amongst them.
Andy Shank, who's like
the worst. A
terrible person, but also on his, like, he's always been technically one of Trev's friends. And in fact, there's a group of them. There's also Carter the Farter.
Carter.
The Fartmeister.
And others, yeah. Who are basically, they've always been Trev's mates technically because they support the same team. And so Trev is just like questioning everything. And he actually fights Andy, which is, he's the guy that you shouldn't fight because he's psycho and all that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Which kind of goes to show not just, he's had this existential moment, but also he's like, Nut is his friend. He's made this friendship. And, you know, male friendship is a crucial part of all sports stories.
Yeah.
Or most sports stories. Some of them are about female friendship, but you know what I mean? Like that.
Yeah.
The bond.
Yeah. That friendship is important, and he's so upset.
Yeah.
And Angua is so cross because her time has been wasted with this complete non-murder.
Yeah. And Dr. Lorne is pissed off.
Because it counts as a murder even if an Igor fixes you. Like, even if you come back. If someone has... And I thought that was a great detail. I'm like,
That was great.
Yeah.
Yeah, but this doesn't count as a murder because he just walked up and left.
Yeah.
Which is what you want, the doctor's saying, but he's a bit confused.
Even though we later find out he was actually killed.
Yeah.
In this case, it counts as wasting
police time.
They can go back,
There's another
it's fine.
lovely little thing all the way throughout is the use of the term "the old Sam" to refer to the guards, the police.
And it's nice to see a book where we do see the Watch from the perspective of, you know, the regular person who are, you know, suspicious of them and don't trust them, and they know that they'll give you a good kicking if they get a chance. Like, it's a different side to the police that you kind of do see in the Watch books. Like, we've kind of talked about this on the podcast before, in that, you know, the way the Watch is written. I mean, first of all, it comes from the British policing tradition, which is a bit different from where you see like American cop shows coming from. But also, Terry walks this interesting line in the way he writes about the Watch, where he kind of is having his cake of, I'm telling a police procedural story and how cool the police are and how they're integral to our society, but also, aren't they also a bit awful? Like, he kind of, I think, manages to have a bit of both. And this one is like, well, we're seeing them from the outside, so we get a bit more of that.
And even a very idealized, in some ways, police force, which it is in some ways and not in others, especially as it's got bigger.
Yeah.
The bigger it's got, of course, the less it is under Vimes's eagle eye. But even under Vimes's eagle eye, let's face it, it wasn't always that great.
No.
But from this point of view, most of our protagonists are actually breaking the law. Like, on a regular basis. At this point, football is still illegal. It's one of those things that they don't get arrested for because the Watch look the other way. But they are basically all kind of participating in something that's not an official legal part of Ankh-Morpork life. And then there's the whole riots and murders. So you can see how the police would very much be hating game night.
Yeah.
Because it would make their life so much easier, so much harder.
Yeah.
Just the fact that these people are just rioting and beating each other up, and both in and out of the game.
That's why Veterinary's on board too. He wants to get order.
Yeah. I think it does come back a bit to your point earlier, which I think is quite a key kind of criticism of police as an institution, which is that, you know, they're not really there for the people, certainly not people like Trev and Juliet and Glenda. They're there for the property and for people like the patrician and the wizards.
Yeah.
And that's something that I think that comes through pretty clearly in this book as kind of not a direct criticism. I don't think they really see it. It's not talked about that way. And all of our protagonists, like you say, they are breaking the law, so they'd be seen as, you know, criminals. But yeah, there's sort of that other angle to it, which I quite liked seeing in a Discworld book.
And we have this whole idea of the new football versus the old football, which is sort of starts to happen after this, the development of the new game.
Yeah.
Which has been instigated by the Unseen University, but it's sort of happening in other places too. And they seem to be turning, instead of the existing teams, kind of, I don't know if they officially get dissolved, because I think anybody would want that, but there's definitely a sense where these new teams start coming in, which are much more workplace-based teams. So, like, the guilds are thinking about doing their own teams and all that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Some of the businesses.
I think the old teams are still there. The challenge becomes, so what happens? Let's get through some of the plot, because I don't want to leave any listeners who haven't reread the book recently behind. Nut is dead and comes back to life. Trev is inconsolable about this and then hears that he's alive, so it's okay.
Oh yeah, he eats a lot of pies.
He does eat all the pies.
Comes back and eats like 9 pies.
That bit did make me want to eat a lot of pies, I will confess.
It sound very good.
Yeah, I was like, I could really go a pie, but I have to keep reading this book.
There were very few vegetarian ones, so I guess I was saved from
the pickled onion one with the cheese.
And crispy.
Pretty sure that had meat in it as well.
But she could she would make you one. Like, if you were like, she would make you so many different vegetarian pies. Like,
true.
Yeah.
True.
In fact, there's the apple pie.
Oh, that's true. The apple pie at the start.
The first pie she gives Nut.
Yeah.
The courting pie.
Oh, so good. But we'll come back to pies. We've got a good listening question about pies. But Yeah, so there's a few things that happens there. He comes back to life. He's eaten all the pies. He psychoanalyzes Trev and kind of solves his daddy issues, which is a great scene. Just sort of in one conversation, just cuts to the heart of it. Because as we learn throughout the book, Mr. Nutt is a voracious reader and understands everything he reads and can perfectly do anything he understands. So he is expert at so many things in this book. He's a candle dribbler, candle maker, alchemist, blacksmith. What else?
Talk to horses. Even horses are suspicious of him, but he's like read about them so he can make it work.
Learns the horseman's word.
Yeah.
He's got all that stuff going on. He knows he can do anything basically as long as he can understand how to do it. This is quite intimidating to other people, of course. But he's also an expert at love poetry, and Trev wants to write a love poem to Juliet. And there's this great sort of back and forth joke where Trev writes his poem, and it's basically, "I fancy you. Do you?
I think you're really fit.
Yeah.
Do you want to go on a date? No hanky panky. I promise."
Yeah.
And then Nut turns into this beautiful long love poem with all these flowery big words and expressions, and Juliet can't understand a word of it when she finally gets it, and so Glenda translates it back into, "I think you're fit. Do you want to go out on a date?" No hanky panky, probably. And it was very funny.
It's like Cyrano, but better.
Yeah.
It is a better version of Cyrano because nobody gets hurt and nobody gets like embarrassed.
Yeah, everyone
which are
gets
the two
their
things
thing.
that are awful about the Cyrano story.
I am forced to agree with you.
Yeah.
But it hurts me because I love Cyrano stories so much.
Cyrano stories are great, except they're also kind of awful when you're in the middle of them.
You just got to add Glenda and it's better.
And all you add is no one getting hurt. That's the thing. If you've got somebody awesome for Cyrano that's better than and more suited to him than the actual girl he thinks he's in love with, the story is solved.
Hooray.
But tragically,
that's
other
not
people
how the
don't think that
original
way.
goes.
But no, thank you, Terry Pratchett, for fixing Cyrano. We appreciate you for that.
I mean, he also fixed Romeo and Juliet really quickly. Everyone always says, "Oh, if only there had been like these 2 or 3 different plot changes." He's like, nope. He just like sets it up and he's like, yeah, they're fine. Yeah. There are a lot of rumors. The fact that Trev and Juliet were seen as holding hands in the shove has spread like wildfire, which is fascinating because it's like, how could anyone see anything? But also they become this story of the Dolly Sisters boy and the Dimwell girl who were holding hands in the shove.
Yeah.
But we do get a good Glenda threatening one of the guys from the Allentown University saying, "I'm just holding a knife. We're all holding knives. It's fine."
Yeah. One of the other things that happens in that scene when Nut comes back to life and after he psychoanalyzes Trev is he has this moment of really connecting with other people at the football where he really feels like he's part of the shove, and it's this like beautiful community moment where as much as it's like sort of violent and out of control and kind of dangerous, it's also everybody's there for the same reason and their hearts and minds are all on the same thing, and he finds it kind of beautiful in a way that Glenda also talks about, and so does Trev. Like they all have this common experience of what football means to them, and it's not just about football, right? It's about the community. It's about the group. And he experienced that and he loved it, right? And he never really experienced anything like that before. Because we get bits of his backstory. You know, he was basically enslaved by a village. He was chained to an anvil for 7 years and made to do blacksmithing for them.
As a kid. Like he wasn't grown yet.
Yeah. And then he was freed by our old mate, Pastor Mightily Oates, with forgiveness, which we later found out, spoiler alert, is the name of his axe. Great reveal.
But he also somewhat saved himself because he could lift an anvil by that time.
Well, that's true. And then he goes to stay with Lady Margalotta the vampire, who we meet in The Fifth Elephant, who gives him full access to her library and says, read whatever you want, learn whatever you want, like make something of yourself, but also instills in him this sort of mantra that he must do these certain things to be accepted. You know, he must be friendly, he must be nice to people, and most of all, he must acquire worth. He must become worthy.
Yeah.
Because he sees himself as worthless before he does this. Which is, heartbreaking.
It's so interesting the way it comes out too, because this is like, we see this through flashbacks and we're not even told who the lady is, though it does become all kind of obvious. But it's clear this is going through his head, and we see somebody who was incredibly capable and confident and doing all these amazing things and kind and doing these amazing things. And his head, he's got this whole like humble thing. Later, it all comes out that the reason for all this is because he is an orc. And the thing about orcs is they're pretty much designed to rip people's heads off. And so a lot of conditioning has been put in to try and keep him safe and to keep people safe from him. And the other side of it is that all the other children were killed. All the orc children that were found were all murdered, straight up. And he's the one who's been given a chance at life. But of course, and that whole renewal of life that has become a pattern in Ankh-Morpork, where somebody from a culture previously thought to be an enemy gets to come to the city and learn how to people and just sort of become an Ankh-Morpork citizen. The dwarves and the trolls, and everybody's had this chance. Even the goblins that people are currently, they're like the last ones people are looking askance at. And that's what he was there under the cover of being a goblin. You know, everybody gets this chance, but he is seen as this irredeemable creature by a vampire who thinks this of him. And so he's been programmed to the point that he doesn't even know yet that he's an orc.
Yeah, it's behind a door in his mind.
He's got this pattern in his head. And it's interesting because we were talking about the other characters like Glenda and her. You know, a lot of them are all carrying these ghosts in their heads. Like Trev has his old mum and what, you know, he kind of can't do. And Glenda has her mother in her head. And Nut has the lady.
Yeah.
And everything she gave him and everything he's grateful for. But it's also, incredibly sad that he still thinks that he has to make an effort at finding worth. When actually he's been doing really well and he hasn't ripped anybody's head off.
Yeah, and not only that, he's been doing all this other amazing stuff. It feels to me also like there must be an element in there of that sort of working class Protestant work ethic kind of like, I must work hard, I must be valuable, I must be productive, which so many of us struggle with. You know, like feeling ashamed of taking time off or not working at 100% capacity all the time. You know? It's
even for a minute, like taking a day off and not being productive for one day.
Yeah.
And that whole thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that comes in with Glenda and Juliet, because when Juliet has this offer to, you know, be a supermodel and be all glammed up and be lovely and get taken to foreign places and things, Glenda's first instinct is absolutely, you can't trust this. But also there's this sense of like, this doesn't happen to people like us.
Yeah.
Of this idea. Thing. Yeah, exactly. And there is a lot of that in the working class mentality of don't look above your station and don't try and be better than everybody else. There's the anti-elitism thing that we see in the football things. You know, part of what infuriated the gang against Nut was honestly the fact that he was stringing together an articulate sentence that they didn't understand.
Yeah.
But there's a sense of don't be too fancy. Don't have dreams that are too above yourself.
Yeah. But I think that changes for the characters in the book. And one of the times that it changes for Glenda is when she starts to decide to break the rules. And there's this great thread in that for her of going, you know, there's all these threats of things are going to happen to you if you step out of line. But I think the line is like, the hammer doesn't actually exist. Like nobody's actually going to do anything. You know, and so she starts to exploit that to do things like trade a favor to get into the meeting that the faculty is having about how they're going to organize football and what the rules should be, because they publish the ancient rules of the game have been found inside the urn. So they're the rules they're going to use to revitalize football. And she gets into the faculty meeting and talks back to the wizards after a few askance looks, and then has quite a robust exchange with Ridcully, pointing out some of the flaws of their ideas, like putting UU on the front of their kit in the wrong place to make it look a bit inappropriate.
Fecund.
Yeah. And that comes back several times. Like, you know, there's later in the book, she just goes to the oblong office and bribes her way in with some pastries to see the patrician and have a word to him. And she does that twice, actually, because she goes back again with Nut at the end of the book. And you're like,
absolutely.
This is great.
And she becomes brave and she starts doing things she never dreamed. Even like that thing of like having a glass of champagne, which normally she'd be like, oh, that's not for the likes of me. I don't deserve that. But she's suddenly like, what if I do deserve that glass of champagne? What if it doesn't matter whether you deserve it or not? You can have it anyway.
Yeah.
And so she starts treating herself to all sorts of things, including being brave and being outspoken.
And having ideas.
And as it turns out, the fact that she makes amazing pies actually does mean that she gets away with an awful lot that she never thought that she could. She's been building this social currency for so long. As soon as people find out she's the lady with the pies, the world is her oyster.
Yeah, she keeps the onions crispy even within her pie. That's
Yeah. I love when later on she's talking to what she thinks is Lady Margalotta's assistant, but then realizes after the conversation is over was actually Lady Margalotta herself and is kind of horrified. But Lady Margalotta figures out how she does the crispy onions and she's like, how did you know that? It was great.
But that's really cool too, because the one thing we've learned about Lady Margalotta, who we spend a lot more time hearing about than actually seeing in person in the books, is she's an intellectual match for Vetinari.
Yeah.
That's the thing we know. And so she instantly figured it out. I mean, that suggests also that Vetinari probably could have also figured out the pie thing. He chooses not to because, he doesn't really see, he's quite happy to have people bake pies for him, as long as he trusts them not to
poison them.
Poison them.
That's such a great line where he's like, I trust her not to put any poison in the pies, not because she doesn't want to hurt me, but because she has a respect for food. So
we learn that her grandmother, another sugar bean, so the name is being passed down through all the women generationally, which is always something I love. It's like the Oggs. The sugar beans, he knew a sugar bean who was the cook of the Assassin's Guild when he was a boy. Yeah. And so Vetinari has this nostalgia wrapped up in Glenda's cooking, and they have this kind of shared thing because of that. And again, it's the power of having cooked for people who remember your food. I read this amazing book a couple of years ago about Churchill's cook who ran the kitchen in Number 10 during World War II. And she had such an interesting life, and she had such a high status as a female cook, which was very rare. Not to be a female cook, but it was very rare to have high status.
Yeah.
But the relationship that she actually had with Winston Churchill and the friendship she had with him and his wife throughout their whole life, even though she was only their full-time cook for a short period, it kind of added to, this epic reputation of this woman. She was interviewed on TV in the 70s still, because she still had this kind of epic reputation of being the cook, who cooked for somebody important.
I would like to read this.
Yeah, we'll get it in the episode notes, listeners, so you
absolutely.
won't miss out either. But look, again, we've got to get back to the plot here.
I know, it's just so hard. He introduces so many things that you just want to go off on tangents, but Ben, you're absolutely right.
Also, he doesn't write linear plots, but yes, let us continue.
Yeah, it's fine. But this is where we get to the fashion show. This is because
okay, good. Yes, we want to talk about this.
Gets Glenda to promise to go with her. Glenda almost changes her mind, but then is like, no, I should do it. And they go, and it's at this very high fashion, fancy, dwarfish chainmail shop, where they also have all these like fancy axes and things like for the lady dwarf who wants to look a bit more like a lady.
And as a sign of how Glenda's attitude towards Juliet starts to change as well as our readers' ones, before this, every time Juliet brought it up, Glenda would be like, that's for dwarves. You're looking at the wrong page because you're a bit dim. And at this launch, she keeps noticing that there's actually quite a lot of humans here. So it's not just that Glenda's like looking at the wrong page or anything. She's actually tapped into something that a lot of people are like on the cusp of. So it's where you kind of sort of go, oh, actually, she's not just like being silly and coming to the thing that she's not supposed to. She's actually a little bit ahead, or she's on the right page quite literally. And it was Glenda who was wrong.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And that sense that there are things that Juliet knows more about than Glenda. Because there are a lot of things in the world. Yeah. And up till now, the only things they've ever really talked about are things that Glenda knows about.
Not $400 like boots made in a boutique.
Yes.
Yeah. And Glenda's got her one sort of frivolous thing, which is the romance novels. And anything else that's not like very practical and proper, she's not interested in. So this, but also she hides
the fact that she reads the romance novels. Like
she's
it's
kind
secret,
of ashamed of it.
Whereas Juliet is reading her Bubble magazine in the kitchen and openly.
Yeah,
and where people might sneer at her for reading that sort of thing, she doesn't care.
No,
she's always like does what she wants, and part of that is absolutely pretty privilege, where she just drifts through life and she never really has to do that much and everything's fine. It's a combination of pretty privilege and Glenda doing everything for her.
Yes.
But she has been building knowledge and skills in her area.
She was right about micromail and how it doesn't chafe. It was not just a joke originally. I was kind of like, they're going to show up at this thing and it's going to be like all dwarves and they're silly and we're going to move on with the plot. And I was like, no.
But it's all so serious.
Yeah.
And Juliet is valued by these, what seem like terribly important people, and Glenda starts to see her slipping away, which is a scary thing with your only friend.
/ child, because They do have that kind of
slash
relationship.
child, yeah. But seeing like her future rolling out before her, and it's terrifying. But it's also just this thing of seeing her blossom. You know, the thing of somebody who just goes through their life and they're just an ordinary person, but then there's like the one thing that they're into, and sometimes that thing kind of can turn into something amazing. And yeah, we see that happen with Juliet. She's in the right place at the right time.
And snapping
dwarf fashion
into who she's always been. Because there's like a disparaging comment earlier about like people like being who they are, but like it's about how it's not real in that magazine, but it kind of is for Juliet, and that's nice.
Yeah. Yeah, and she also has her real kind of romance novel kind of Cinderella moment, and there's a lot of mentions of like Emberella or Cinderella throughout, not heaps of them, but there's a few. But this is like the one real moment like that, because they're not just at the fashion show in the right place, but also the right circumstances. Like the actual model who's supposed to be showing off the micro male has had an anvil or an axe or something dropped on her foot. And so they need a new one. And the proprietress, Madame Shan, and her fashion designer and male maker, and yes, probable lover, although there's a question mark on that. But anyway, Pepe, they are there and they spot Juliet and they're like, we need you. You need to do the thing. And
bring your mom.
Glenda has a internal discussion with the sherry that she's drinking, which was a great sort of through line through this scene I really enjoyed, about trying to sort of intervene, but also maybe just let her do the thing. Like, this seems amazing. And they dress her up, including in the beard. She goes on the stage and she is a massive sensation, just blows it out of the water. Everyone is incredibly amazed by her beauty, the way she carries herself, by her personality and the way she's just very down to earth at the party afterwards. She just talks to people and says, watch her.
Yeah, she just talks to people and she's so unself-conscious.
Yeah.
That the things that Glenda would be like fitting the whole fist of her hand in her mouth in embarrassment over saying something like that. But Juliet, she doesn't care. She doesn't care. She's not pretending to be posh.
No.
She's not pretending to be anything other than what she is.
She's
she never needed to before.
But Glenda also manages to negotiate her a deal 5 times better than she was offered, and also a discount. So there's also thank you, Glenda and Sherry.
Yeah, well
yeah,
done.
yeah. She becomes her agent.
But I think it's also that she's in her element. You know, this is what she loves. Like, she's really into this whole world of fashion and design and dwarf male. And so when she's talking to people who are also into it, she's very comfortable. And I kind of really identify with that. Like, I remember when I went to university and I met people who were into Terry Pratchett and like role-playing games, and I'd never really had that growing up. And I could be around those people and just talk about that stuff. I felt so comfortable. I was like, these are my people. Most of them anyway. You know, it's like, hey, this is great. It was cool.
It's lovely. And I think you're right. It is a universal experience, and it's nice to see that with female characters.
Yeah.
Something being treated as a universal experience. Because, it's not just about the fact that it's a fashion show. We see her blossom, and Glenda decide not to hold her back. Though she's also at this point assuming it's a one-off lovely experience that Juliet will take back with her and always think about, and not that this is like her career. Because that just seems impossible to think about. It's just like, oh, this is a cool thing that you did once, and now you're going back to your steady job in the kitchen. And it takes a lot more unpacking for Glenda to be at the stage of realizing, oh no, the steady job in the kitchen is actually, maybe it's okay to ditch that. Not saying everybody should necessarily ditch their day job straight away, but
do we also all have the universal experience of, I'm uncomfortable, I'm slinking off to the bathroom, and oh hey, I've actually made good friends with someone else who's like also awkward and we're not in the party?
Yes. Absolutely.
Yeah.
But just that thing of the distressing nature of the fashion industry when people who aren't in on it meet it. That sense of like, you know, your industry that makes so much sense, you're not used to, and then an outsider comes in and is like, what is happening? Why do you do these things? And you're just like, everybody who's in the cult is just like, no, this is normal. Yeah. We work 15 hours and then we like all drink coffee and then we like sleep for 2 hours and football's a bit like that too. It's like this complex world with all these rules, and then somebody comes in who doesn't get it. And it's weird. Like, everything's weird when you explain it. It's like when people find out that you go to science fiction conventions.
Oh, yeah.
Or, you know, medieval recreationists. But every community is weird if you look at it.
I was never super into it, but high fashion got really ruined for me when I read a non-fiction book, and I've forgotten what it's called, about the industry. And I found out that you look in glossy magazines and you see these high fashion shoots, and so rarely is anyone involved in them paid, including the models. I'm not doing justice to the book, but it talked through like going on the set, taking all these photographs, doing all this work, and everyone's just sharing a tiny room in Paris with a shared bathroom down the hall and everything. And it's about how luxury brands will make bespoke dresses, not paying their seamstresses well. All the money comes from the gloss of like selling the dream, as we later get into. All the money comes from buying a lipstick of the brand. The couture dresses, which are expensive, is not what makes them money.
Yeah, there's always this dark side of it, of a fantasy lifestyle. And we see that in professional sport. You know, it's like the people who are completely, it's quite predatory, and the fashion industry is predatory. And like, we learn an awful lot about the film industry, you know, we keep relearning it. But like when Me Too happened, and it's like, oh, and then you realize actually people have been straight up making jokes about the casting couch for 50 years.
Scream 3 is straight up. Like, I'm like, how did that movie get made with all of what it's actually about? But I kept waiting for the book to be about how predatory the fashion, or at least nod to it, and it was kind of like, no, it's a nice industry that you can go into. And I'm sure it is for some people, and it probably would be for someone of Jules's caliber.
I still remember one of my, getting back to Pratchett, but one of my the things that really just lodged in my head from Masquerade was the thing about how hungry all the ballet dancers are. And it's just like, they're just so thin and so hungry. And it's just, it's not good.
Yeah. Well, the other couple of big things that happened before we get to the final football match. First of all, Glenda sneaks into the big meeting where the patrician addresses all the captains of all the existing football teams.
The big banquet.
This is what's going to happen. And the banquet. And he gets them all drunk on beer and matches them beer for beer and explains what's going to happen. Nut has been working on what the sport is going to be, because it turns out he's got quite an instinct for this, and he sees it as this sort of beautiful version of war where nobody has to get hurt.
A beautiful game, perhaps.
Yeah. The way he talks about it is quite amazing. So he gets delegated that job by Ponder to sort of figure out what the rules should be and how it should be played. And they assemble a team which includes the exchange wizard, Bengo Macarona, who is just a natural talent at the game.
Exchange wizard.
Yeah, he's clearly like a stand-in for Maradona, you know, like the super talented player who everybody just sort of holds up as like the pinnacle of the sport.
Also, the first time we've ever had it acknowledged that sometimes wizards have sex with other wizards.
Yeah. Well, with another wizard or just with another married man?
He's acknowledged as potentially bisexual, but also it leads into this whole little speech about Ridcully musing on other wizards he has known who, you know, and actually they all just prefer the company of men, so it's not a surprise, and love is love and all this. Like, I'm writing an essay at the moment on celibacy and the wizards. It will be published in March,
nice.
So I need to finish it soon.
Yeah.
You know, because this whole thing of the celibacy and they're not getting married and they're not having sex, and is the idea of sex actually not compatible with magic? But then there's the whole sorcery thing. Anyway, I wasn't expecting to add more to the essay from this book. And one of the things I'd be thinking about is all the way along the assumption of preventing wizards from having sex so that they don't produce sorcerers. It's like, really does assume a very heterosexual view of the world. And suddenly, in the final Wizards books, we are getting acknowledgement that queer wizardry is a thing. And it was very exciting to me.
Yeah.
I think the bit about Juliet and her effect on the wizards is also going to be in the essay. But the whole thing about Maradona and Ridcully's little speech about actually he just sees the whole thing as being perfectly fine was just such a nice little touch to come across.
There was a little bit of the let a thousand blossoms bloom about that speech, but only a touch. Like, it was not as crazy as that.
Is it only a touch, or is it a little bit more?
But it's really interesting because we have this thing about Maradona, and then, of course, we meet Pepe, who I'm sure we will talk more about.
Oh, such a fascinating character. We'll get to...
Anyway, sorry.
He's got his whole section at the end. It's fine.
Is this when the ball has also been... Because the creation of the new ball is... Okay.
No. They have got the new ball by now. Because they realise you can't play a beautiful game that is suitable for the old rules using a bit of wood with some fabric wrapped around it. So they go to the Cabinet of Curiosity, introduced in Making Money, and they ask it for a perfect football, basically, and they get a soccer ball from our world, right, is what they get.
Yeah.
But it has to go back into the cabinet, so they entrust Nut and Trev to go and get a copy made, which they do. And so that becomes the new ball. That's the ball that goes glowing.
Yeah.
And there's a great display of football at the banquet, but all the drunk captains are forced to sign a thing saying we agree to the new rules. And they're sweet-talked into it, and they're made drunk so that they agree. And Glenda is kind of affronted by this because she feels like the game is being, it's like you were saying before, the gentrification of football. The game is being stolen from the working class people of Ankh-Morpork and becoming.
And it's so interesting because she sees this happening, but also she actually wasn't that bothered about football all along. Like, she's the one who wears the football scarf as a form of camouflage because of where she lives, not because she cares about the game. And she's always thought it's too violent and a bit silly, but she goes along with it. But yeah, she is just filled with this righteous outrage. And it is a class issue as well. It's how the men of her neighborhood are being manipulated by the wizards and the big meals and the bribery and the booze. There's this whole scene, which is amazing, where Juliet's dad has the invitation to go to the dinner, and he's so suspicious and he doesn't understand it, and it's so fancy and it's scary. And so all these men are being like taken to this place, being treated like kings, and they sign away the old football, which, like, I'm on the side of the new football, and like you can see why, but it's interesting because it's an equivalent social change to what happened with the guilds. But we didn't see the thing with the guilds happen in real time. That was established at the beginning of the Discworld books. The fact that the guilds, like, thievery was replaced by the Thieves Guild and all that sort of thing. And so this is an equivalent veterinary thing, really. Like, he is moving behind the scenes to make this happen.
Yeah.
And you wonder if all that was accomplished through big dinners as well, maybe.
Probably. It does seem, I think that's his way of dealing with these things, if he can get away with it.
Turning crime into civilization.
Yeah. After the banquet, the new rules are public news. They're published in the Times. That's when Glenda goes to see the patrician and says, you can't take football off the people. You're trying to destroy it. And he's like, yeah, am I though? Like, it was pretty bad. Like, people died. Do you not remember that? And she has to admit to herself that, maybe there is a good reason to do this. And
he's so drunk. The whole thing with veterinary where he was drinking
beer for beer.
He was matching the footballers drink for drink. And everyone's like, it must be a trick. The trick was he just did all that drinking, and the next day when she goes to see him, he's still drunk. And the only sign of it is that he's a little bit more forthcoming with his thoughts than usual. But you can't tell to look at him.
It was so good. I love that.
I think he's just drunk for the rest of the book.
Veterinary is someone who would do like a shot an hour for a period of time, though, to make himself more able to drink in advance of situations like this, to train.
That's true, but it is established in the book that he does not normally drink. And in fact, he does not have an alcohol tolerance because he doesn't normally drink.
I'm just shocked that it's not like a tactic that he would do, though. He'd be like, I got to train like everything else.
Poison.
Exactly.
I feel like, it must be Assassin's Guild training that he's resisted all kinds of other poisons so that he still gets drunk.
Helps him.
But he's able to resist the effects of being drunk.
Also, his personality overcomes everything else.
Oh, yeah, you can't.
But I love the fact that he is still drunk the next day, and it's like 3 PM or something.
Yeah, it's pretty
And Drumknot is so freaked out.
Yeah.
Drumknot has never been drunk in his life. Like, not,
and no wonder Glenda gets through with a pie, because he's quite peckish at this point. He's got the munchies.
Now, the other thing that happens here is that Pepe turns up at the university, and he does this a couple of times because he's looking for Juliet, or Jules, as they call her, and Jewel, as in, a shining jewel, as her official dwarf fashion model name has become. And they're not really sure where she is, but she's just gone back to work because Glenda told her don't give it up. And this sort of leads to a bit more of a discussion, and eventually Glenda's like, no, you should definitely go with him. But then once she leaves with Pepe to go off to a life of being a model, one of the other people from the Candlevats, the troll, who's kind of dealing with some addiction issues, shows up to say that Mr. Nut is sick. And this is one bit in the book where I was like, I don't feel like there was quite enough of an established incident to trigger this maybe, but I guess where it comes from, I'll be interested to hear what you think, is that he's sort of, all these accumulated bits where he's sort of pushed himself outside of the boundary of what he has kind of allowed himself to do previously. And maybe he's got swept up in enjoying things and liking things, and he doesn't feel like he's accumulating enough worth, which is the sort of mantra he has going on inside, has pushed him to the edge where he's like, oh, I think I can see the shape of what's behind the door in my mind, and I'm really scared about it. And so he's gone into this sort of like state where he's afraid it's going to happen and he needs to do something about it. And the way that they deal with it is that, which I kind of love, is that Trevor says, well, can't you just sort of talk yourself, if it's a mind thing, can't you do what you did for me? And he's like, I can't do what I did for you. Someone's got to talk me through it.
He's like, give yourself a pep talk, man.
Yeah, what if we hypnotize you so you can do it to yourself? And that's effectively what they do. They chain him down and hypnotize him so he does a Sigmund Freud impression and psychoanalyzes himself into opening the door and realizing that he's an orc. And at the same time as he's doing that inside his mind, these bird-like creatures, which have shown up briefly and a couple of times earlier in the book, come down, and they're the sisters of, is it the Sisters of Perpetual Velocity or something like that?
Yeah.
And they're Furies, and they've been sent by Lady Margalotta to keep an eye on him, and they go, orc, orc, like a bird, but what they're actually saying is, he's an orc.
Yeah.
Which was very silly.
And it's interesting too, because it's like, it's suggested it's like to keep him down, but it feels like straight up sabotage.
Mm.
And I think it's really interesting that Margalotta, who has set him on this path, actually doesn't have faith in him to pull it off. And at this point is like, we're starting to see that her intentions towards him are maybe not as kind as he has always felt.
Mm.
And that she doesn't trust him. She doesn't have faith in him. And at this point, it does feel like she's actively trying to sabotage him. And I don't know how much of it is it because he's been taken away from her because he's part of the city now in Veterinary. I don't know, but it's quite nasty. And the fact that, he's got these Furies basically telling him effectively that he is worthless, and he has his existential crisis upon realizing he's an orc, and he's so devastated because, of course, he knows all about orcs. He's done all the reading and everything he knows to be true. He knows everything that's been written down about them by humans, basically.
Yeah.
And it's something I think that does come out later, and it's very much something we sort of see his friends help him through. This idea that regardless of what orcs have been in the past, what he is like a football fan who's a bit nerdy and quite kind and likes pies. And for most people from now on in Ankh-Morpork, that will be what an orc looks like, because he's the only one they'll ever have met. But it takes a while to get to that realization. But at this point, he's just so devastated at the revelation of what he is. Far more so than his friends, who honestly are the beginning of that. Like, they have maybe vaguely heard about orcs.
Yeah.
But honestly, they'd be more upset that he was on the wrong football team, you know?
Yeah.
Could it be a gentle parallel between like Glenda's relationship with Juliet, where she's always seen her a certain way and then she's worried that she's pulling away, and so she's like holding on a little bit tighter before realizing. But also, Lady Margalotta's experience of orcs would be the texts that have been written down and the human slanted perspective of it. So she might have always expected him to fail. And so she's the first sign of anything going wrong. She's like, well, my worst fears are actually, this is not defending her, but it's, as we learn across the whole series, I think she thinks that she's doing the right thing. Yeah. Yeah. She gives him all these mantras that are helpful in the short term, but that suppress him in the long term. Yeah. So while she's well intentioned, she doesn't have true faith in him at a deeper level. And so that's coming through now. Yeah, and it's absolutely the Glenda and Juliet thing of like not letting them make mistakes. Now, in the case of an orc, they're worried that making mistakes would lead to, ripping off heads. But then the protection of young women is also something where there's a lot of fear and terror around, especially beautiful young women. Like, there's always this sense that, the horrible things are going to happen to them. Because let's face it, a lot of times they do. But that sense that they can't make mistakes, especially that young women can't make mistakes in the same way that, say, young men can, and be forgiven and be redeemed and grow past it. Young women will often carry those mistakes in a different way. But yeah, I think there absolutely is. I know we've gone through the meetings and things. Are we up to the big carriage ride yet?
That's kind of the next thing that happens, because Mr. Nut he goes back into his little place and he's doing his candles, which he's made some candles that light into specific colors. I love that there's a joke that he's really struggling to do blue, which I'm sure is a reference to the fact that for a long time people couldn't figure out how to make blue LEDs, but now they can, which I thought was a great sort of obscure tech reference there from Terry. But
I was having just never understand sexual jokes, but we can go with that.
Yeah. But he leaves. He runs away.
Yeah.
And they band together to go after him, even though Juliet is supposed to have left and gone off to being a life of a model. She keeps coming back because she's trying to find Trev and wants to say goodbye and sort out things with him.
It's fascinating. Glenda's so frustrated because having done the big thing of letting Juliet go, Juliet keeps coming back because other things are more important.
Yeah.
And Glenda's like, but no. And it's that whole thing where she has to accept that Juliet might have a glittering career, but she also has to accept that Juliet and Trev might be a thing.
Yeah.
Because in the past, Juliet has had the most appalling taste in men. She's always picked the worst guys. Trev is actually the best guy she's ever liked. But he's also somebody that Glenda didn't look at twice and kind of didn't see a problem of rejecting. So Glenda kind of has to accept that if she's going to let Juliet make her own decisions about her career, she also has to let her make her own decisions about her romantic life.
Is that Nobby Nob's Tawny thing as well, though? Like, we're only the worst guys, like, will sort of be like, oh, well, she's so beautiful. Well, I don't.
It's kind of the running joke, of like, and they do actually say it's because it's basically only the real dickheads will actually ask out a girl that pretty. The others are just, and in fact, Trev does think he's not worth worth her.
He struggles with that.
And that comes back to this idea of like, are you worthy? Are you good enough? So the fact that he asked the question means that he probably is.
Yeah.
It's the ones who don't ask the question that are terrible.
Yeah.
And I think this is done with a bit more nuance than it was when it was a Nobby joke. So it is the same joke.
Yeah, for sure.
But yes, they all run off after and there's this whole elaborate thing with the carriage because they don't have enough money.
Because it's a bus.
And then the slow bus.
Public transport has come to the Discworld in various forms. So there's now, there's an omnibus, which is a cart. It's a horse-drawn cart, but it's a horse-drawn bus.
My Fair Lady joke.
There's also this great thing where there's the night buses around the city. But then there's also, you can like get the equivalent of a taxi. You can flag down a troll who's got like a couple of chairs slung around his neck.
But he gets graffitied if he goes to the wrong neighborhood.
Oh yeah, that was so
But that's
funny.
the full like ancient Rome thing of like hiring a litter.
Really?
Yeah.
Because in ancient Rome you weren't allowed to have wheeled vehicles inside the city, and so you had slaves carrying litters that you either owned yourself or you would hire if you were wealthy. So that's the fancy transport.
Yeah.
But that whole thing about the horse bus that's incredibly slow, but it's cheap and so it's affordable.
Yeah, because people could afford time,
And
but
you're
not money.
not using your own legs.
Yeah, and Glenda always does that at the end of the night. And in this case, it's the horse bus to
Stolat.
Okay, good old Stolat.
Yeah, the nearest sort of city outside of Ankh-Morpork.
Yeah, and they manage to kind of blag their way on with a small amount of... They try a little bit of, like... Trev straight up tries to, like, mug the driver, like, do full highwayman stuff.
Yeah.
And he cannot get away with it.
No, he's too transparent. He wouldn't do it.
They all call his bluff. He just can't do it.
So I'll get the lead pipe but also a smooch and also some... what?
Yeah, and they end up with a small amount of money, and a kiss from Juliet is enough to get their thing. And they, like, pick up Nut halfway there, but of course the bus has to keep going in the one direction before it can turn around.
Yeah.
So they end up collecting Nut on the way and then having their whole, like... all the pep talk and telling him how great he is and all that sort of thing.
All the other passengers chime in with their thoughts about the philosophy of, but people come to Ankh-Morpork and they're all right. They're nice people.
Yeah. Like,
my best friend's a dwarf, the kind of stuff.
It's a really lovely sort of like thing about, how he will be accepted as an orc just by being a decent guy, ultimately. And it's all fantastic. And then they eventually get to Stolat and they've got to like hang out in a barn or whatever. And then the driver's going to take them back.
Well, the other thing just about that trip, though, I think there's also a nice undercurrent of Glenda sort of recognizing that this is the democracy of the people where, like, yes, you are accepted if you fit in. But if you step slightly out of line, that same group of people can turn on you in an instant. And it doesn't happen to Nut because he's a lovely person and everybody likes him. It's one of his talents is liking people, which then makes them like him.
Yeah.
But there's this recognition from Glenda that I think is very relevant to Australian culture and society that if you step out of line, though, that could all vanish in a second. And I think that's a really good recognition of what happens in our culture, you know?
Absolutely. And she's like, you know, we're all waving banners about her getting brave enough to stand up for herself and do things and to stop holding herself back with that hammer that doesn't exist. But at the same time, it kind of does exist. And that whole idea that, these people on the bus could as easily be a lynch mob or with the flaming torches. And that whole thing of, as a young working class woman, there are certain things if you do or say, maybe everyone will turn against you.
Yeah.
It's kind of the opposite of a chase scene.
Yeah.
You know, those big chase scenes where you have the big emotional moment at the end in a comedy or a romantic comedy. And this is like the opposite of that because it's incredibly slow. And they have the conversation while the bus is moving.
Yeah, I really liked it.
But it's a very cinematic moment. I think it would look amazing on screen.
Yeah. I actually thought that several times through this book. Like, I think we've talked many times about how Pratchett's writing, particularly in the Discworld books, feels pretty cinematic. But I think this book particularly, I was like, this would make a great film, or a great TV series.
Well, I gotta say as well, because I listened to this with the new audiobook read by Colin Morgan, who is fantastic. I mean, they're both great. Like, Stephen Briggs is also great, but Colin Morgan is amazing. Don't love his Rid Cully voice. It might be because I just came off Lords and Ladies, and Indira Varma's Rid Cully voice is better.
Oh, no.
I think he does it a little bit too old and quavery, which is one of those mistakes people make.
Yeah, he's
everything else is brilliant. And I think one of the things that really came across that wouldn't it's perhaps more emphasized in the audiobook than in the written version, is how people talk is important in this book, because that's a whole class thing as well. So Juliet in particular, she and Trev, a lot of the colloquialisms, the phrases that they use, the way they say things, comes about and just keeps being important. And that theme was really... So people talking to each other. Just got to say, it would also make an amazing audio play, a full cast sort of thing.
It's been made.
Oh, it's been one. Oh, well, in that case, I need to go listen to that.
Yeah. Dirk Maggs produced one for Audible, actually, before the new audiobooks came out. I think it's still available. It's got quite a stacked cast, actually, as well.
I'll have to look into it. Yeah. The voices are so important, but I think you're right. The visuals would also be amazing with this, especially with all the football and the colours and the...
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, look, let's get to the climax because we're nearly there.
Okay.
We stop in Stolap for a bit. This is where Glenda sees Lady Margalotta, and it makes sense that she's traveling through here because all of the transport that gets to Ankh-Morpork comes through here.
But again, crucially, Lady Margalotta is coming to the city. She's following because of Nut, presumably. It's implied that she is.
Yeah.
Or that she's planning to do something about it. I don't know. She seems to be... honing in on, perhaps because he's become a public figure because of the football or because of something to do with veterinary.
It's not quite, it's not specifically stated why she's there, but it's probably something.
I reckon she's there actually quite often and we don't know about it. Not because she's doing hanky-panky with veterinary. I'm sure they get just as much satisfaction out of their games, but I think she's in Ankh-Morpork more often than we know.
There could be that, but absolutely there is a sense when she gets there that she's like, it feels like we learn a lot more about how wary she is of Nut and how little she trusts him and all that sort of stuff.
And I think that's because, she's never fully been on board with he is redeemable. Yes. It's an experiment to her, and she's always expected the experiment to fail, is my suspicion.
Yeah.
Now, here's my question about this. So one of the other angles with Nut, of course, is that the reason I think why Pratchett chose an orc and didn't just leave him to be a goblin is that partly it's a play on the whole mysterious origin of orcs in Tolkien's work, right? Is that there's not one definitive origin of where they come from.
Yeah,
and also
a species that's made.
Yeah, they're made somehow, but from what and by who is not 100% clear. And there are contradicting accounts of it. And later in his life, one of the things that Tolkien sort of regretted about the work was he actually was on record in one of the letters or something later saying that he feels it was a mistake to make orcs like irredeemably naturally evil. Like that was not an okay thing to do, and he regretted that.
I think it has become very embedded in fantasy genre as a whole, not necessarily just the orcs, but this really black or white depiction of fantasy races. A lot of that comes out of Tolkien, and a lot of Pratchett's work has been pushing back against that.
Yeah.
While a lot of other fantasy has definitely double down on some of it.
Well, until recently, it's been a big part of traditional Dungeons and Dragons as well, for example, and a lot of the things derived from that. So I think there's obviously that. But one of the other things that occurs to me is that, you know, here we see, like, one of the things we skipped over is that Glenda goes to find out more about orcs when Nut is kind of says, leave me alone for a bit. I've got to deal with this. I'm an orc. And one of the things she does is go to Dr. Hicks in the post-mortem communications department and sees the memory of someone who was killed in the last war where orcs were deployed. And it is truly horrifying, but also she notices the same thing that Ridcully notices, which is that in the background, there are men with whips forcing them onto the battlefield. And she's like, that's an important detail. They're not there because this is what they want to do or this is their natural instinct. They're there because they're being driven by men with whips on horseback. Yeah. And that's such a big part of this for her. But it's not something that's been addressed. And one of the things that I wonder is Lady Margaret is a vampire. We know she's been alive for a long time. We know that Dark War was about 200 years ago. Was she not there? Like, was she around for that, do you think? Is that why she's so distrustful? Because she's seen orcs in person and she's like, they are horrifying?
Yeah, very likely.
But is the thing, though, like, orcs are things created and conditioned to do the evil that man or whoever does not want to do themselves. However, if you can take one of those things that was conditioned to do the most horrifying things that you did not want to do yourself, to get your hands dirty, is there a redeemable quality within that, even though that was the purpose with which they were created? Yeah. So I think that might be the question. Even if she'd seen it, if they were only made, like in Lord of the Rings, they're made to do horrifying things. If you took one of those ones out and put them in a different environment, is there a different path for them? Like outside of what they were conditioned and created to do. Like they wouldn't exist otherwise if there wasn't this horrifying impetus and whips behind them. So I think that's the question for her. Even if she'd seen it herself, you wouldn't know if there's any other option for them.
Yeah. And there's also the sense where as a vampire perhaps as well, obviously we do see vampires who change, but the idea of changing your mind about something is a pretty huge thing to do.
Yeah.
I think it's really interesting that Nut was kind of, at the beginning, it was just like, well, he was kind of put on this world to make dribbly candles, man. He's just really good at it. And they were very close. The idea of him being a tool, he is potentially like the machine that replaces all the human jobs. You know, he's the full-on spinning Jenny. He's the AI that takes all the jobs, you know? He's the AI who writes all our novels for us because we don't apparently want to do them ourselves.
They should be doing our tax, not our novels.
Yeah. The question that kind of hangs over the book at the end is that what all orcs are like if given the chance? Or is it just him?
And we won't know necessarily because, like, it is emphasized that particularly so many of them were murdered as children because they were like, well, we can't have these grow up to rip people's heads off. But it is interesting that when Nut starts out, he's just, like, good at stuff. But he's now, like, the reason he was put here appears to have been to create this new football, to take his knowledge of strategy and battlecraft and turn something that was very violent into something that is more beautiful and less violent, which is such a fascinating thing that he is the person uniquely qualified. And he is, to date, the only person that Ponder Stibbons has ever delegated anything to.
Yes, that's true.
But it's just so fascinating as a thought experiment because it's nature or nurture, but applied to something that wouldn't exist if it hadn't been created purely to cause destruction.
Yeah. Exactly. But that's not his fault.
Exactly. So, like, it's interesting that you said that Tolkien regrets that he said that they were pure evil because that is such an interesting thing for another writer who respects him to push against. Because, like, anyone thinks orc. You think disgusting Lord of the Rings thing with all of, like, these horrifying stuff. Like, I don't think anyone has warm thoughts outside of this book towards orcs. Well, so when I haven't played much Dungeons and Dragons, so I don't know. If
depends on whether they've read Legends and Lattes.
Okay. Well, exactly. And I was going to say that there is a modern fantasy tradition that goes back a fair way.
There's sexy orcs, aren't there? There's a thing. I seem to remember we published an article about.
Oh yeah, there's also the sexy orcs. Which is happening.
Okay, but traditionally orcs are horrifying monsters, and when this was published, like what was it, 15 years ago, orcs were horrifying monsters of awful like things. So like to push back against that and try and be like, but could we fix them? Is an interesting thought experiment.
Yeah. Well, look, let's get to the climax. They're in Stolat. He reshoes a horse so impressively that it gets them a trip back on one of the really fast male coaches, which somebody, I read some commentary about this where someone was pointing out that his search for meaning and worth is not dissimilar to what happens in Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. And here he is doing the closest thing to repairing a motorcycle that exists on the Discworld, unless you're death.
Also, like, he's doing the most important blacksmith job, which, you know, having just come off a pretty deep reread of Lords and Ladies, you know, Jason Ogg is seen as somebody of such status. He's the closest male equivalent of a witch. Like, that's a pretty high level of craft and worth. And the interesting thing about the horses is that he has the skill for the hooves, and the thing was the way the horses hate orcs and they respond. And that's true of, like, everything he does. Like, everything he does is fine. The fear, it's how people react to him is actually the thing that he's still having to work against.
Yeah.
And the idea that people might be afraid of him. Yeah, that's like, or how they perceive him is the one thing that's still holding him back. And it's got nothing to do with him and what he does. Because he can't really change how people think about him.
No. But they get back to the city and they find that things have kind of gone a bit wrong because one of the things the patrician said is to kick off this new football, someone's going to play the Unseen Academicals team. Put forward a team. It doesn't have to be one of the two big teams. It could be any team you want.
No.
That's fine. We'll have a big exhibition match. It'll be great. And he's
still drunk, right? That's why.
Yeah, but what this means
he's drunk for the rest of the book. I'm pretty sure.
But did he come up with this plan while drunk, or did he have this plan before?
No, I think this was always the plan. But what happens is, while the captains have all signed the thing, there's a bunch of like football jerks who don't want this new football, and they manage to get their way onto this sort of new amalgamated team, Ankh-Morpork United. So there's some of the sort of old school people, cloggers, as Trev refers to them, who actually love the game and they're there for the football. But then there's also half the team is made up of the worst football hooligans, including Andy Shanks. So it's a disaster waiting to happen. And what they suspect...
It's a reverse fantasy football.
It is reverse fantasy football.
And there's that thing of like, everyone's picked their FIFA team made up of the people most likely to stage a riot or murder a co-worker.
Yeah, and they know this is going to be bad because Ridcully has agreed that in order for it to be fair, Arch-Chancellor Henry from Brazenett College, formerly known as the Dean, is going to be the referee, and he's also going to make sure that there's no magic on the pitch. Which means he's going to cast a spell that makes no magic. And then as he's just doing that, Trevor's like, wait, did you also mean your magic won't work so you can't do anything if people are breaking the rules? Because it's clear that they're going to break the rules and just destroy the other team through violence when the wizards can't fight back with magic. And this seems like it's going to be a disaster. And when they get to the pitch to play, there's such an enormous crowd. Everyone has turned up to watch this game. There as a stand for the Toffs, which includes Veterinary, and they're watching. And Jewel is there in her resplendent beard and outfit, and everyone's like,
just like Taylor Swift, which is amazing because the Taylor Swift thing happened 15 years later, but somehow he predicted it.
Well, Posh and Beck's thing.
Yeah.
No, I know.
People were mean to Posh.
No, it's true.
But it does feel like he predicted Taylor Swift.
It does feel like that.
Different
football game.
She doesn't feel like Posh. But she doesn't feel Taylor Swift
true.
either. She just feels like she has Taylor Swift aura.
I'm sure there are other wags that are equivalent. But it does feel specifically like this is the Taylor and Travis thing, and I'm here for it because he was such a foresighted... But what a weird thing to be foresighted about.
But one of the things that is different, though, is that Trev is still adamant at this stage that he is not going to play. Like, he's helping out Nuts,
he
who's
promised
become
his old mum.
Yeah.
Like, Nuts the trainer and, like, the first substitute. And Trev's like, I'll be your assistant, and I'll be a substitute. I'm part of the team, but I'm not going to play because I promised my old mum after my dad died, I'm not going to play. And he says this like 18 times to different people.
Yeah, he's pretty much been the advisor, like, of telling Nut all the stuff that he hasn't been able to learn yet about how football works. So he's sort of there as the expert.
Yeah. Because he knows the old game very well. And he's also a wizard with a tin can. We haven't mentioned this, but he's got immense football talent. It's just that he's only ever kicked around a tin can. He's never actually gone on the field and played with a real football.
Yeah.
So the game starts, and at the beginning it goes really well for Unseen Academicals because Bengo Macarona is a star player. He gets 2 goals, and basically their whole strategy is around this one guy who's incredibly talented, getting the ball to him and clearing the way for him to score a goal.
It's important to note he's a visiting professor, so he hasn't been hamstrung by quite as many of the, like, He hasn't been eating the four dinners a day.
Is it not 4? It's 9.
He has been eating
the 9 dinners. Yeah, he's been eating plenty, but you know what I mean. He's from foreign parts, and that is kind of significant in multiple ways.
True,
especially the way that his football playing is described.
He's a different kind of wizard, that's for sure.
Yes, he is.
But anyway, he's phenomenal. And so the other team, of course, after he scores a couple of goals, and Ridcully gives one of those goals to the other team because he's trying to be magnanimous, but also it's a cunning strategy to put them off. That was a bit of a weird
It's such
move.
an insane thing to do.
It's crazy. He says, there's no rules against it, is there? And he's like, well, no, I guess not.
Side thread of William de Word slowly developing sports journalism.
Oh so
yes.
Good.
That's amazing. Yeah, he does. To the point where he is literally shouting it and getting somebody else to write the words down because he's like, no, I clearly need to be saying these things out loud.
So good.
It is beautiful. Yeah.
Because I was like, surely William de Word's not going to get into it. Then he's like sucked into the magic of it, and it's beautiful.
Absolutely.
And he's getting closer and closer to the pitch.
You are not supposed to be the sports reporter.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I loved that as a thread. And it also was a good way of summarizing bits of the match, like as a writing technique. It was done well.
That was really fun.
It is. And, commentating is also a big part of football culture. It's such a...
Hypes
But
them
it is a good way, having written sports games into fiction, because one of my favorite things is to invent imaginary sports in my books. Commentating is a great way to get a game across.
I watched this great video where someone was like, what if someone commentated soccer like golf and golf like soccer? And then they did 2 videos of that, and it was amazing.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. It all starts to go horribly wrong because the opposing team are like, well, if we're going to beat them, we got to beat them, quite literally. So they take out Macarona after the amazing chant joke, but we'll come back to that. But they take him out by basically dislocating both of his knees. Not good. So he gets taken off the pitch, and Trev is still refusing to play. So Nut comes in to substitute. Then one of the fans for the other team throws a drugged banana to the librarian, who's the goalie for Unseen Academicals.
Yeah.
He eats it. He passes out. Not okay. But Trev still refuses to play, so they play a man short. Ridcully gets taken out. Dr. Hicks gets sent off because he's like going to stab someone with a knife, although it's fake, because there's this recurring joke of him doing the acceptable evil things for the university because he's the necromancer guy.
Yes. He's like, I'm allowed.
So
and
good.
he's expected to. They need a certain degree of that for their reputation.
But it's better if there's sensible people on both sides. In fact, he tries to recruit Glenda at one point because he's impressed with her. He's like, we need someone like you in the evil department. But anyway, he gets sent off, and eventually Trev is persuaded by Juliet to play. Yeah. Not just Juliet, but Pepe. And so he does play, and he is a wizard, but because he's used to a tin can and not a ball, while he can get the ball close to the goal and shoot, he just cannot get a goal in.
Yeah, he's actually quite terrible at this specific sport.
Because he's never played with an actual ball. This is his first time. Even though he helped make it, he hasn't even had a kick.
Nice. I'm so glad it's not like, obviously, all the laws of sports movies tell you that he would be amazing at this point. But he's not. He's a bit rubbish, actually. He's like so almost, but he has full failed potential because it's not a tin can.
It was time for loopholes.
Yes.
I mean, the thing that really gets him on the pitch, by the way, is that, and I don't want to skip this moment because I found it so great, is that one of the things that happens is Nut comes on, he replaces the librarian in the goal. Andy starts taunting him, and then one of Andy's cronies, it might even be his mum in the stands, starts chanting Orc. And it's a real, it had such parallels to the kind of horrible racist stuff that has been thrown at football players, not just in the UK, but here in Australia as well.
Yeah.
And it was such a moment. I was like, oh, that's gross. And then it kind of gets turned around because Pepe convinces Trev to get on the pitch. He's been trying to get him on the pitch the whole time by getting into the stands and getting them to chant likely because his dad was such a hero of the sport. And there's a little passage where it says, orc was a word that they kind of forgot immediately. They didn't really care about that, but likely that was the thing that they understood and they knew. And he turns the crowd back around. But I think it was also, it sort of mirrored what Glenda was saying about the democracy of the people and how it can turn on you, and here it was turning from our perspective as the reader and from an ethical perspective, the right way, like supporting a person rather than taking someone else down.
Yeah. And that's something because the banana was a reference to that too. There was famously the whole thing with the Premier League, decades ago, but it was particularly with the rise of black soccer players, but particularly bringing in black soccer players from outside England. And it wasn't just the racism from the fans, it was the racism from the fans to their team, which was quite like an extra level of devastating, because it was that thing of like, yeah, it's like, it's bad enough when people are doing it to the opposing team, but when they're also doing it to their own team, there's just this level of awfulness, you know?
Yeah, it's like they've picked a hierarchy for their tribalism.
Yes.
And they've put them in a particular order that makes it feel even worse.
And it's something that we see happening in other culture as well. It's like the whole, like, when did Star Trek get so woke kind of thing? And it's like, dude, what are you watching? It's like, why is Doctor Who all about, like, fighting injustice? And it's like, where were you in the mid-1970s? And just like this idea of this thing that I love, and my identity is in this thing that I love, but I'm not prepared to, like, drop my internal racism and homophobia and all this sort of stuff in order to just like a thing. Yeah.
It's this dissonance where, yes, my identity is bound up in this element of culture, of pop culture, but I've also had it drummed into me that my identity is bound up into this other element of culture, which is, you know, racist or misogynist or whatever else. And I can't reconcile the two. I can't, you know, and but it is a choice. Like, you've got to make a choice. It's like, well, do I learn from the pop culture thing that I love that has nurtured me and taught me so many lessons to overcome this prejudice that I've also sort of been inculcated with, or do I not?
Because Nut is very much, I mean, obviously it's like, it's not even subtle that he represents the immigrant who comes into a city and is faced with, you know, assumptions about who he is, literally because of the colour of his skin.
Yes.
But he's also that example of the model migrant.
Yeah.
Like, he is just so well behaved. He's so concerned with worth. He's so good at his job. He's been contributing so much. He's that sort of example of somebody who has done so much for the community and yet will be judged based on, you know,
one mistake and he's out, you know, despite all the effort that he's put in.
Or in this case, not even a mistake, but judged on hereditary, you know, judged on genetics.
Yeah.
It's incredibly shitty.
Yeah.
But it is, you know, as I said, it's not subtle, but it is there, and it's Pratchett, and it's still beautifully wrought in a way that, because there are so many different layers and different kinds of stories all being told at once.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But yes, as you said earlier, it's time for a loophole. And this is Glenda's plan, because she sees that Trev just can't quite kick the ball in. And like, I want to, like, he is good at the game. He just can't get the ball to do the things he can get a 10
Yeah,
can
he's
to
good
do.
at all of it except the kicking of balls.
Except the kicking a goal. Yeah, except the kicking of the ball. He can dribble it like a nobody's business, but kicking it into the goal, no. So she's like, okay, here's what we're going to do. And this was telegraphed, like, because way earlier in the book, when the rules get published in the paper, she singles out one of the rules and goes, oh, I've always liked this one that says the ball is the ball. And then it's unpacked a bit more, but basically it's a rule that says whatever has been handled by 3 players on the pitch is the official ball. And this is to deal with situations where if you lose a ball and another ball comes into play, or someone accidentally starts kicking something else around and scores a goal, we don't want that to be discounted because technically it was the wrong ball. So whatever ball is in play is the ball for the game. And she takes advantage of this by getting one of the players on her team to kick the ball off the pitch to her. She goes and stands with the cheerleaders led by, who are like all of the cookie staff from Unseen University, led by Mrs. Whitlow. Great little detail. But she gets
a nice little callback to soul music where they were like, you know, the 50s Grease dancers.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that was
nice.
Cool. But but anyway, so they kick the ball off the pitch. And then she hides it under Mrs. Whitlow's skirt and tells them, don't tell anyone it's here. And then she says, the ball's lost, substitute ball, and throws Trev's tin can onto the pitch. And he is then able to run rings around them and score a goal. Because by that stage, things have degenerated in the game so much that Arch-Chancellor Henry, who is constantly being possessed by the spirit of an old referee from the university.
The old sports master.
The whistle.
Yeah, so haunting the whistle.
If you don't have your kit, you have to do the thing in your pants.
And such a good joke as well, where they talk about how it's all about possession. Just very funny.
Yeah. And it's pointed out, like, they're in a magical field, which means that there should be no magic on the pitch, but this possession, you know, is still happening.
Is that magic, though, or is that something deeper?
Yeah, it's something
darker?
Other than magic. It's a nice little loophole.
So
yeah.
good.
It's about trauma.
It's sudden death, so they win. And that's kind of the end of the game, sort of, mostly.
It kind of does Lord of the Rings 3, where it's like, we're over. No, we're not over. We're back. No, we're done.
There's
no,
a few
we're
other
back.
things that have got to happen.
And there's a whole thing where Trev and Juliet kind of become this literal golden couple. And
yeah, she runs onto the field and rises up into the air and starts glowing, and he rises up in the air. And they're all like, but this can't be magic, right? Because it's prevented magic. And the one kind of thing that Glenda says, oh no, I think it's religion. And then she listens to the roar of the crowd as it's happening and hears this chant, this poem, which Pratchett identifies in the dedication at the start as being a parody of the poem Brahma by Ralph Waldo Emerson. And it's meant to be like, this is the spirit of the goddess who was the goddess of football coming back.
And that's something that's been hinted throughout, that idea of sport verging on a religion, and a few things that they say. It's like, is that the way that the rules come together and the way everything like this, it's almost like it's magic, but it's not magic. And then it's like, well, is it something else? It's a lot. Like, it's not quite a Dungeon Dimensions kind of idea that we see in the earlier books, but it's got that slightly otherworldly feel about it.
Yeah.
That it's all coming together to be this story.
Yeah. It's pretty great. But the sort of the end of the match is, first of all, Andy's like pissed off about this, and he challenges Trev. He runs up to him while he's like just finished kissing Juliet, and they've sort of descended back to the ground. And he kicks him in a fork, to use the Pratchett expression, although he doesn't use that in this book. He just does not describe it that way. And it has no effect because Pepe has previously given Trev a pair of micromail shorts that are specially treated with what he calls, what did he call it? It's retributium, which is basically Discworld vibranium. Because it absorbs the impact and sends it back to where it came from. So Trev is protected while Andy efficiently kicks himself in the foot really hard. So that was great. But then that's not quite over, because Andy also like, I'm going to get you, Nut, and sort of advances on Nut. And Nut tries to talk him down, but he won't be talked down. And so Nut lets the orc out a little bit and easily overpowers Andy, and in fact has him on the ground with his hands around his head, and loudly figures out how much force and what difficulties there would be in pulling somebody's head off, which is like really full on. And I didn't remember this bit from the book, and I was like, oh, I don't know why you're going here. Why would Nut do that? And the crowd starts chanting orc again.
It's to show that he can, but he chooses not to.
He chooses not to. And I think, it's a deliberate move on his part to go, I could do this. This is who you think I should be or could be. And then he gets up and doesn't do it. And he does something that Trev advises him to do right at the start of the book when they go into the first football match. He says, like, look, if anybody challenges you, just say quietly, oh, yeah, but go if you're hard enough. And people will think that means that you're tough and they'll leave you alone because they'll see that you're one of them. And he says that to the entire crowd, and there's a little pause, and then they all just start cheering and applauding, and it's all sorted out. And it's like, oh, okay. I don't know. I felt a bit in two minds about that, but it kind of works, I think.
I felt like it was necessary, like, because it's sort of because he can, and everyone's like worried that he will, and so by doing that, he shows that yes, I have the ability, but I also have the control. This man has like slighted me. I absolutely have all the power. I could have ripped his head off, but I have so much control in myself that I simply will not. And I've shown all of you that I won't. So therefore, the orc in your minds is not the orc who I am, and therefore you are incorrect. And I think that kind of solves that.
But also in a kind of reverse Eliza Doolittle situation, he's also learned to talk like the streets.
Yes.
That's true. So instead of, he might be saying all that stuff that you just said, Liz. But actually what he says is, come and have a go if you think you're hard enough. That thing of he's learning. And because there were some nice little scenes of Trev kind of trying to teach him to talk just a bit more like a normal lad, and a bit less posh, just so he didn't get his face kicked in. And so people think he's ordinary. That thing of actually talking down and code switching. And because in other words, you always had Glenda like wincing when Juliet was being her, normal Cockney Sparrow self, and was kind of wanting her to be that little bit more sort of, I don't know. There's this whole thing of like how people talk and the language that they use. And he learned to talk to the people, even though honestly a lot of them probably would have been quite excited to see Andy's head pulled off.
Yeah, there's that description that, the hippo, which is the field where they're doing it, and it's also where they have the cart tail sales, it's like car boot sales where people buy back their stuff, has also seen a lot of violence, like a lot of gladiator fights and stuff. And so there's that's mixed into the sort of aura of the crowd and the spirit of the audience that's there.
But as we discussed, he can't do that. He can't do it even once.
Yeah.
Because if he does, he'll be the orc. And again, that comes back to the whole racism allegory as well, with black men and how they have to kind of often comport themselves in public, and the way that their anger is seen differently to the anger of white men, and how they're judged on different standards and all that sort of stuff. There's this sense where he cannot afford to make even the slightest mistake. Yeah.
And not just the anger either. I mean, you see with Adam Goodes, the Australian football player, who he didn't really get angry ever. Like, I mean, he did sometimes, and that was very reasonable with some of the things people were saying to him. But even when he just had pride in who he was, and people just losing their fucking minds about it.
Yeah. I remember it was controversial that Kathy Freeman had like the Aboriginal flag as well as the Australian flag after winning gold medals at Sydney Olympics. It's like, you know what? You win a gold medal. You're allowed all the flags you want.
Do whatever you want.
Yeah.
Yeah. All the cheese trays, everything.
Yeah. It's a whole thing.
I think he explored football in such an interesting way by showing these different levels of it. And yes, there's the romantic idea of we're all one when we're watching a game, but then there's the reality of how horrible people have been, and using it as their excuse, the tribalism of the teams as their excuse to be horrible to each other.
Yeah.
But the fact that Nut actually kind of uses a certain degree of toxic masculinity.
Yeah, to get away with it.
In a positive way. It's not quite Ted Lasso level, but it's, it's not far off.
Yeah. You've got this very erudite, not just Nut, but also some of the wizards, like very, very intelligent, very erudite, very philosophical people engaging with football, which is often seen as the opposite. And particularly the training regime that he puts them through, which is like a lot of stuff that you've heard about, like from the 80s and 90s in football, of like
it's a montage of every sports movie. Yeah, I love that he takes them to the ballet. It's not even like a later thing. It's like the first thing he thinks of. It's like, well, if I'm going to train them.
Yeah, it's like, I need some money because I'm going to take them to the ballet. Yeah.
I need a ballet budget. And it's like, okay.
So good. But it reminded me of Ted Lasso, where you have some of that same kind of stuff coming on. But it also reminded me of Australian comedian Damien Callanan has this great film called The Merger. They do all this stuff that you don't associate with football. Like, they talk about fine art. They go to see Shakespeare. They practice putting the other team off by finding out a lot about them and saying nice things to them, very personal, nice things to them whilst they're playing the game. Like, it's incredible. It's so good. And I think that it shares some DNA with what Pratchett's doing here.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which I really loved.
I think it's been very interesting, especially when you consider that, like, there's this whole elitism and the intellectualism versus sports. But of course, the UK especially has a pretty huge tradition of like university sports as well. Like, that is quite a big thing.
Which is obviously alluded to in this book, not just by the fact that it's the university playing football, but also, Rid Cully at one point says, I rode for this university for 5 years and I was awarded a brown, which is a play on, getting awarded a blue, which is something that Cambridge and Oxford do.
One wonders who he rode against. And was it like an official thing? Because there's clearly been no organised sports at this university for a long time.
It's a good question. Maybe the guilds. Who knows? The final, the Lord of the Rings movie ending parts.
They could do that without the scouring of the Shire. How dare they?
I know. There's no scouring the Shire. But they get taken off the pitch. They have an after party at the university where they all eat and drink as much as they like. Madame Shan and Pepe attend. And Pepe does two things. First of all, he helps, it seems, Madame Shan hook up with Bengo Macarona. Who's given her the eye.
I have now decided is Pedro Pascal in any future version.
Oh my God, yes.
Love it. Perfect. Perfection. But yeah, so, which is great. Very cute. Like he says, like, look, his knees are still not working, but I don't think that's going to be a problem.
She can work around it. It's fine.
There's a lot of very lewd jokes in this book, actually.
Yes.
There are.
So many.
A lot of them from Pepe.
Yeah. Well, we got a question in the Making Money episode about whether the whole thing with the dog and the toy was Pratchett's lewdest joke. And I'm like, no, there's like 5 jokes in this book that are way more dirty.
This book that I had never read. And I was like, whoa, what is this filth?
Yeah. So that's the one thing that Pepe does. And then the other thing that he does, he goes out into the streets, finds Andy and roughs him up and says, if you retaliate for what happened today, you will answer to me and it will not be pretty. I've been on the streets. I've had people treat me really badly and I can take care of myself and I will take care of you. And he like cuts him across the forehead.
Which was foreshadowed, like the cool eye patch thing, which is a footnote. It's like if you, like, I'm pretty sure he takes out an eye. He's like, if you, like, because there's that footnote that's like, if you cut through an eye and have a scar down your face, you'll never pay for a drink again.
Yeah, he does. He does like give him a scar on his face. I don't think he like literally takes his eye out, but he does give him a scar across the face, and there's blood dripping into his eyes, so he can't see. And he leaves something on the ground for him and says, here's something to mop up the blood with. And Andy's like, I'm going to get that guy. I'm going to get that guy. And he like scrabbles around and grabs it and wipes it on his face. And that's when he discovers it's half a lemon, which I was like, oh, that's so awful. But at the same time, this fictional character deserves it. Suck that. But the other time, at the same time as the party's going on, Nut and Glenda, who have had this beautiful moment where they sort of realize that they're into each other during the coach ride. We kind of skipped over that, but Nut says this great thing about how ships have to be careful when they're close to each other on the sea, because the fact that they shield each other from the bigger waves means that they move slowly towards each other. And she says, like, how quick does that happen? He goes, well, quite slowly at first, but then at the end, very quickly. And I think like the romances in this book, the 2 main romances, I feel like they're amongst Pratchett's best.
Absolutely.
They feel real.
Yeah.
Really loved these characters getting together, you know?
I gotta say, one of the things that I have noticed, especially having, you know, written a whole book of essays about women and now writing a whole lot of essays about men, one of the things about most of the early romances is that the large majority of them, the point of view is mostly the male character. That's not always the case. Like Angua, for instance, gets some point of view with Carrot. There's a bit here and there, but it's an awful lot of some of the big romantic pairings. The women actually, we don't get inside their heads very much. And this book is so interesting because we really only get, it's really only Glenda and Nut, but we get fairly equally, I think, in their heads. And Trev and Juliet, we don't really with either, but we don't really need to. They're a little bit more surface.
Yeah, we
and
see them
we
from
learn
outside.
about them through their friends. But it feels like a very balanced book. It's not just, you know, a Vimes novel in which Sybil is talking, or like, you know, some of the early ones like your moving pictures or whatever. I did this whole piece about romances in the Discworld, or particularly the unromantic romance and how often the romance is undercut. And my argument ended up being that one of the best romances, and certainly the first half of the books, is actually Detritus and Ruby. And their romance is so much better than, like, for instance, Victor and Ginger and a lot of the other ones, largely because it's all about, you know, a woman asking for something and the man actually listening to her and trying to give to her what she needs.
Yeah.
And it's so rare to see that. But no, Glenda and Nut are lovely. And there's also, I'm not sure when it comes, but the scene where she's guessed, or she figures out and she calls him on the fact that he wrote the poem for Trev, because she's guessed that. That's a bit of a gimme. And he says, did you like it? I wrote it for you. And that's that beautiful follow through of how to make Cyrano so much better. The fact that it wasn't just that he wrote Trev a romantic poem to give to Juliet. The poem was all about Glenda. It actually had nothing to do with Juliet. It was all about the kindness and, you know, the pie, just who she was as a person. And so ultimately it had, through its various translations, reached its proper goal. And that was just so, they're just so sweet.
They are.
And
they're
just
just so
beautifully.
sweet.
Like nothing feels contrived out of these.
Yeah.
Like it felt like it was actually properly leading there and it was the natural outcome.
Yeah.
I do feel like we spend more time in Glenda's head than in Nut's head, though. Like,
potentially, yeah. I think because he's so important to the main story, perhaps. So, but again, that's rare. It's really rare to spend more time. Yeah, I think an equivalent may be with the whole thing with Magrat and Verence, where we get more of his point of view early on and then more of hers later on, and then like different books.
Yeah.
And so it sort of all balances out eventually. I don't know. There's something about this that feels very balanced.
Yeah, no, I agree it feels balanced, but I think we get a lot more Glenda's internal thoughts, and we get what Nut is about through his actions and what he says, because we don't really spend a lot of time with his thoughts.
Yeah.
And I think that you see that in this last scene where instead of going to the party, they go to see the Discworld equivalent of Romeo and Juliet. They go off on a date, basically, to the theatre, which is quite cute. I like that. And then the next thing they decide to do is they're going to go and see veterinarian Lady Margalotta. Knows that he has to sort of meet his maker, and he wants her to meet his maker as well, because that's how he sees Lady Margalotta, as though even though she's not the person who created the orcs, she's kind of the person who created the person he is now.
Yeah.
He was rescued from his fate by Pastor Oates, but then Pastor Oates brought him to her, and she was the one who kind of
shaped him.
Yeah. If he needs to prove his worth to anyone, it's to her.
Yeah. I think this is the really interesting thing about this scene is that Vetinari's like, yep, this makes sense. I'm all over this. Whereas she's like, I can't believe you're talking to me this way. I can't believe that this is the thing you've come to say to me. And I think that she's taken by surprise is the thing that sort of shows she didn't really understand who he was or have that faith in him.
Yeah.
And now he gets to show who he is and that he understands what he's got to do, because she wants him to do something, because it turns out he's not the last orc. There are some orcs left in Far Uberwald, but the dwarfs want to wipe them all out because they still think that they're horrendous and evil and irredeemable. And she's like, I think you should go and see them and maybe you can help them. You can bring them civilization. And he talks back to her and says, yep, okay, and who's going to do that for the human beings? And you're like, yeah, nice one. No, that's great. And this is where, he speaks through his actions, is that he says, but before I do that, Lord Vetinari, I'd like to borrow one of the golem horses that the post office has. And he's like, yeah, sure, I don't have a problem with that. Do whatever you want.
Vetinari is still drunk.
He's still drunk, but he's very happy, though. He's also
he's having a great time.
Whatever.
Yeah. This is Vetinari's favourite book.
Yeah. Maybe this is his trick, is that he got as drunk as a person should, but he's just spread it out over a long period of time.
Yeah.
So it's very it's very subtle drunk instead of like, I'm going to die because of how much alcohol I've had.
Sure, you can ride my motorcycle. That's fine.
It's a little bit more chill than usual.
Yeah. But the reason that he wants to borrow it is because he's heard that Glenda always had this wish, as Juliet mentioned to him, to feel the breeze through her hair in Quirm on a warm summer's evening. And he's like, well, if I get one of these horses, we could just go there right now and do it. And
that's so cool.
We get her, more thoughts of like, there's so many reasons, practical reasons why I should say no to this. This is crazy. Why would you do that? And then she's like, yeah. And you're like, yes, like doing it. It's so good. And then the final ending is Rid Cully goes into Ponder's study where he's doing all the paperwork, and he says to him, look, you've been pretty busy. I thought you just might like to hear the news that over at Brazeneck College, where they've made this thing called PEX, which is basically Hex but with chickens instead of ants. It's produced like a giant monster chicken that's like destroying Sidopolis, and the old dean has had to rush off home. We could do something about that, but are we in a hurry, do you think? Basically, is his attitude, and Ponder's like, what kind of chicken? What kind of eggs does it lay? No, I think we can just finish some work first, and then we'll go and help them with that. And then Rid Cully leaves, and there's this great bit where it's like, he has a smile.
Yeah, they're going to have an amazing road trip. Because they've had this, elaborate one-upmanship thing throughout. It's been so interesting to see, but ultimately the fact that he can go and save the other Arch-Chancellor from a giant monster chicken.
Yeah. Of his own creation.
Well, and not even just the other Arch-Chancellor. Like, I don't know, like the Dean leaving to be Arch-Chancellor of Brazeneck, I get it.
Yeah.
I hate him. That's fine. He's very hateable, but also lovable. We love to hate the Dean. But I felt more betrayal that Adrian Turnipseed, one of the high-energy magic building students who has featured in a very minor role in several of the other books, has gone off to be the ponder of that other university and lead their higher energy magic building. And I found that more of an upsetting betrayal than that the dean left.
And nicked all of the academic, like the work that they've been doing.
Because they're sharing it openly, but then he's just using it blatantly.
Done his own knockoff version.
Well, he clucked himself over there, right? So
they got a giant chicken, and that's what they deserve.
Yeah.
We should get into some questions, but very quickly before we do that, is there anything we haven't talked about that we want to quickly shove in here? And I'll see if I can fit it in when I edit this monster of an episode.
I would like to talk a bit more about Pepe. Like, I think he's such an interesting character, especially as he is. Like, I know it's a few books since Monstrous Regiment, which is perhaps the the most queer Discworld book, but most Discworld books have almost no mention of any kind of like homosexuality at all.
Yeah.
Apart from maybe the tiniest little hint here and there. And suddenly we have a book where we have a fairly substantially like significant character who, while it doesn't actually say straight up that he is gay, he's very queer-coded in such an explicit way, almost to a problematic level. Like, he is quite a predatory character.
Yeah.
He's very sexual, like, almost all of the, like, filthy jokes we were talking about, they're mostly Pepe-related.
Yeah, that's true.
And his relationship with Glenda is really interesting. They meet several times, and ultimately he is instrumental in... he's kind of the fairy godmother. No, he's... I was just thinking of all the stuff he does for Trev at the end, which is interesting because there's no specific motive there for that except that he knows that a footballing husband is going to be really good for Jules's career. Whereas early on, he's really explicitly like he wants Jules to be the model, he wants her, and so he has all these conversations with Glenda, but there's a lot of challenging her, everything about her. Also constantly making these sexual references. He's very camp, like extremely camp, but also there's that whole sort of thing at the end where like, yeah, he can absolutely punch Andy Shank and like beat the shit out of him. These are not contradictory things, but it's...
No.
Yeah, so in one ways it's like, I don't know. I had a lot of feelings about him as a character. It probably didn't help that Colin Morgan, while doing the voice for the audiobook, makes him at least 50% more skeevy and highly sexual than he is in the book.
Oh, no.
Which is alarming. It's so
How is
alarming.
that possible?
I know.
Wow.
Yeah, I know. It's a lot in the book.
I have mixed feelings about how he's written because I think I agree with you that he is queer-coded, and in fact, he's one of the few characters that Pratchett is on record as saying, in fact, I think the quote, this has come up a couple of times, he said in an interview in Melbourne that he's as gay as a tree full of monkeys, I think was the phrase that he used.
Is that gay?
Apparently so. Well, it'd have to be a gay tree full of gay monkeys, but
I don't know. But I mean, first of all, I read him a bit more as bi because it's pretty clearly and heavily hinted that he's in some kind of arrangement, at least, with Madame Shan.
Yeah,
although,
that's true.
As a dwarf.
Like, it's not exclusive, but I feel like they're boning.
Yeah.
They've got some kind of very intimate relationship, which is not necessarily sexual. It's not necessarily not sexual. And it comes down to, it's not really explicit. They're clearly each other's person. But is it like a Will and Grace situation? Or is it like...
Well, I mean, he's setting her up with another dude at the end.
Yeah, exactly.
Of the thing, so.
And there is a very... Yeah, I don't know. There's a lot of complexity going on here for one of the first overt gay male characters in the series. Yeah.
I felt like he was bi and poly, like there's in like he was like setting her up, also, but like they also have their own thing. Like, and I saw that as sexual, but not exclusive.
Yeah.
Absolutely. He's definitely one of those people who flirts with everybody. Like his conversations with Glenda are very sexually charged.
Yeah.
But that's not, it's one of those things that it's hard to tell.
I was like, if there's a spark with the person, I felt like he'll go for that.
Yeah.
That was kind of my energy from him.
Yeah.
Absolutely. But then there's the way he talks about himself, like in that last scene where he's doing over Andy, he says, the reason I'm doing this, Mr. Shank, is that I am a bastard. I'm an old bugger. I am a sod. And he's saying those words in the kind of, I'm a hard man, I could fuck you up kind of way.
Yeah.
But he's also being very careful. And like, those words are not chosen by accident. He's also...
No, those are historically charged terms.
Yeah.
And that's the thing. A lot of the characterization and the characters we find in the Discworld books are very old-fashioned by nature. And partly that's because of the deep layers of historical kind of context.
Yeah.
And there's also just a general old-fashionedness even to the most modern sort of things that we find. And so it feels in some ways like he is a gay character from a 1970s TV show.
Yeah.
Maybe. Or maybe something from the 80s. Or maybe, you know, something written by Russell T Davies, but set in the 80s. You know, there's a certain kind of very old-fashioned queerness about him as a character. And, you know, a lot of those early characters that we saw in media who we look back on and go, oh, yes, that character was clearly gay, but the way they were written was in a very careful way of protection.
All insinuation and innuendo.
Yeah. But it was just interesting to me, especially because I have been, as I said, writing this thing about wizards and celibacy. And one of my things was like, oh, all the wizard stuff is all really heterosexual, isn't it? And then to suddenly come across this book, especially that we've got more than one example in the same book. Like, it's not just, we don't just have Pepe, that we also have Maradona. Macarona. Even if he's not a very significant character, the fact that it's there all is very interesting to me.
Yeah, Andy's definitely joining them later. Like, come on, he's going to beat up Andy, then he's going to go back and be like, "Are we interested?" Or
yeah, for sure.
Yeah, but no, it's definitely worth talking about him as a character because he is potentially very problematic in a very old-fashioned way, which I think is one of those things that people are running into the trouble with trying to adapt Pratchett to film for a modern audience.
Yeah.
Is that sense of a lot of what's in there is quite, because it's influenced by a lot of old-fashioned kind of ways of doing things, but it also means some of the tropes and some of the character archetypes and stuff like that. There are elements where it's like, can you actually do that for today's audience, or do you need to reshape the character? So, yeah, I know. It's interesting, but I did enjoy him.
My very brief thing before we go to questions or Ben's one is big shout out to the footnotes. And this footnotes are always a joy, but I felt like every single one in this was a banger from the beginning through to the end. And my favorite one was Juliet rising from the peas cart. No one else sees how beautiful it is except for one artist who then goes on to make a painting of it, and everyone and it's literally called Beauty Rising from the Peas Pudding Cart, attended by cherubs carrying hot dogs and pies. It was widely regarded as a masterpiece, though no one could ever work out exactly what the hell it was about, even though it is extremely literal. So I thought that was just A+ material.
That was great. Yeah.
Absolutely.
I think there were a lot of good footnotes. I think my favorite one is the one where they mentioned the Ankh-Morpork Trespassers Society. And then there's a footnote that says, it used to be called the Explorers Society until Vetinari pointed out, people already lived in all these places you say that you discovered. And I was like, that's so good. Oh, very good.
Thank you, Vetinari.
There's so many great bits and things that we could talk about, but we don't have time because we want to get to some listener questions. We're going to switch it up a little bit. I'm going to ask these questions. We won't be able to get to all of them. We got so many great ones. But one that a couple of people asked, We Mad Arthur on Facebook and also Mark Shoulder over on Mastodon, both picked up that this is actually not the first appearance of football on the Discworld. While here we're looking at Poor Boys Fun, played with an ash wood, leather and cloth ball, and they invent a new soccer ball. In Jingo, Carrot is playing football and he's got an inflatable pig's bladder. And Julie, also on Facebook, said that even back in Reaper Man, Ridcully mentions wanting an unseen university football team for the big city game at Hoxwatch. So a couple of people asked if we had an idea. Like, obviously it's mostly Pratchett not caring about continuity getting in the way of a good joke or a good idea for a story. But if we were to try and come up with some sort of in-universe explanation for this, what would it be? Is there one?
Well, I mean, I don't think the pig's bladder thing is such a contradiction at all, because clearly they've been playing football or some variation with just about anything that comes to hand. The actual game of, like, that we see, like the proper organised game, clearly couldn't be done with just an inflatable pig's bladder because it wouldn't survive the first 5 minutes. Whereas a little game of, like, pick up football with a carrot and a couple of kids in the street is perfectly acceptable. So I don't see that as being a problem at all, leaving aside the fact that clearly it's just because, you know.
Pratchett's had this idea about football in Discworld a few times, and this is where he actually got a story out of it rather than just a game. Yeah. Meanwhile,
the whole thing about Ridcully and football previously is like, well, he could be thinking about a completely different sport. True. Maybe he looked into something and he found out about that other version of football that they play in 4X, and that's what he was referring to.
Someone else did ask us about that briefly. I like that 4X gets mentioned a lot. Like at one point, someone in this book, I think it's Trev, is like, I'm going to grab this and some tickets to 4X, like when he feels like he's got to get away.
And I get some of our beers from the docks.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, there's 4X beer. And I like that that gets mentioned. I say we're not 4X. We don't really live there. But
we are.
We though?
Come on.
We kind
let us have this.
But I like how much of a thing it is as a mention, but I'm a bit sad that we never quite go back there, even just briefly, or that there's not a major, I think more so that there's not a major character from there. I feel like that was sort of a missed opportunity, but that's all right.
Yeah, it's not like, I mean, bringing Australians over to importing them to play football doesn't happen very often in the year.
Oh, no, I don't think...
it doesn't happen these days, but I'm pretty sure it hadn't happened when he wrote this book.
Oh, no, I don't specifically mean I wish it had happened in this book.
No, I know, but that would be
general.
like one of the ways, I guess, and it is nice to see that they're bringing in wizards from other places.
Liz, did you have a crazy theory about...
I feel like Tansy has solved it. Like, they just beautifully, neatly solved it.
Yeah.
You're welcome.
Yeah, it's got the ball that it needs for the sport that it's become.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
I don't think I could do better.
No continuity errors. It works.
More questions.
More questions. Oh, so I said we'd come back to this one. So Fearless Dust 2073 on Reddit asked us, what did you think of the chant about Bengo Macarona? It's a lot of words for a relatively small punchline. And Stephen Briggs deserves a lot of respect for committing to it in the audiobook. I got to ask, Colin Morgan, did he really commit to that?
Absolutely, he did.
Great.
And you know what? It was not boring. It was great. It was great to listen to.
I've got to listen to it. I want to hear how
it is worth it. Yeah, no, it's great. You know what? There's nothing like, and it goes back to, because this isn't the first time that Pratchett has done this joke. It's the same joke he told in Pyramids about the full name of the pharaoh.
Yes.
With Tepik, where it just goes on, and it just keeps going. And again, in the audiobook, it is like a lot more than it needs to be, but it's funny, man. And, you know, it's not like he individually typed it out. He definitely copy and pasted both times.
Yeah.
It's brilliant. It's a funny joke.
You know what I realized reading it this time?
Yeah.
In the first chant with just his name, not any of his titles, they only say his name 3 times. But in the full chant, when they use his full list of titles, they say his name at least 4 times. Like, it's even longer than it needs to be for the joke.
But also, I mean, as always, the portrayal of wizards takes me back to my own history with academia. And it just feels very true and beautiful.
Sorry, we should have introduced you as Dr. Tansy Rayner Roberts, PhD, brackets, classics.
Absolutely.
Brackets.
Every time you speak to me.
Every time.
How many times have you said your name, though?
Yeah, we don't say no very often, so we're getting away with it on that score.
You say that, but from now on.
Yeah. We also had a question from Rin Betancourt via Facebook, who had a couple of things to say about the book. Obviously, she enjoyed this a lot. But she felt like with the fashion show, Pratchett really played with expected roles of who was doing what. And wondered, is this something that Pratchett does a lot? Is he changing his society on the disc by pushing these roles, or is this something he's doing more in this book than in other books? I'm kind of reading between the lines of your question there, Rin, but I think that's what you're getting at.
The industrial revolution of the Discworld is clearly an ongoing theme, and it is something we see. Often we see like a big change happen and then it's like referred to later. Every now and then there's something that sort of slips in that changes, like probably the Clacks is an example of something that kind of was there and sneaked in as little jokes, and it's there, and then suddenly we get like a book that really kind of delves into it. Makes it a big deal. And there's a lot of that sort of thing. Even like the first time we get to the books, like I was talking about with the Thieves Guild and the whole thing of turning crime into bureaucracy. The Discworld has always been changing, including just before we started reading the books. And we see a lot of cultural changes as well as technological changes, which I think the whole industrial revolution, which has become a kind of accepted name for some of the books, like a sub-series of the books, often tying together a lot of ones which are basically standalones. Yeah, I think we see a lot of social changes too. I mean, Rid Cully was one of the biggest changes to the university because of what the vibe he brought when he came in, kind of in some ways gentler, but still as effective as things. The changes that came about in Lanka, we've seen a lot of changes. But yeah, I don't know. I think this is a natural evolution of the dwarf sexuality storyline we've had throughout, especially through Cheery Littlebottom, and that idea of dwarf women having to actually come out as women and learn gender presentation and using human elements in order to do that because there's no language for femininity in their culture. Yeah. And that is, I mean, it is such an interesting thing that he did and continued to do quite consistently. And we saw a little bit of that with Trolls through Ruby, the character of Ruby back in Moving Pictures, where she's like, I want to be courted like one of these human ladies.
And there's some of that in this book too, with Glenda selling the dream to all these troll ladies.
Oh yeah,
which we kind of missed over. But Mr. Strong in the Arms making all these cosmetics for trolls, which is an incredible subplot that makes it feel like, you know, she's so into that idea of selling the dream.
A little bit, and part of that as well. That's another example of the trying to rise up from your station. Like,
she's become an
Avon pyramid selling and selling cosmetics was one of those ways that women were able to actually earn an income, especially women who were otherwise stuck in domestic service.
Yeah.
And she gets into it and makes her own ideas by like time
she
buys
does.
Oh yeah.
She didn't believe it, and then suddenly she's like, actually, what if we did this and that and that, and you should actually try this because I've been on.
She makes all these business suggestions to him, and he listens to her, and that's a lovely story, and it does mirror the dwarf fashion in really interesting ways. Because what we also see in this that's I think most interesting is this idea that the feminine dwarf fashion is starting to affect humans, and that humans want to dress like dwarves.
Yeah.
That's such an interesting development.
Or even that they can be dwarves, because let's not forget Pepe is described as an almost dwarf, and it's not entirely clear, but it
takes Glenda a little while to figure out. Yeah, she's not sure if he's a dwarf or not.
It's pretty heavily hinted that he's kind of become a dwarf in a way similar to Carrot is accepted as a dwarf because he's raised by dwarves. In some similar fashion, Pepe has become accepted as a dwarf.
Yeah.
Because he speaks the language, and he talks about having, you know, sort of converted to dwarfism, so to speak, which is a terrible phrase that really sounds not quite right, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
But that kind of, I think, segues nicely to a question we got from Grace on Instagram, who wondered about the question of Juliet being a model for dwarf clothing and whether there's cultural appropriation issues with that, or if not that, a disservice to the target audience, since it's not going to fit dwarfs in the same way as it will fit a human. And we kind of addressed that, Liz, because you were talking about how it's an unattainable body ideal.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's true, but it is also true that we had the same problem with putting all the clothes on size 6 or size 8 women. And the fact that so much fashion for so long was designed for a really specific body type that not only didn't necessarily size up in comfortable ways, but then became, you know, we've got so many layers of problematic around it, but also this idea that you need to like shrink down to fit into an outfit and all that sort of thing. So, I mean, yes, cultural appropriation is an aspect, obviously, having a non-dwarf.
I'm not sure if it's a cultural appropriation.
Well, not necessarily cultural appropriation, but like that sense of, I mean, yeah, I can see why it's potentially problematic, but then the whole industry is, and frankly, this version of the industry is a lot cozier than the absolute horror show that it is in our world.
Yeah.
So there's that.
Because it seems pretty clear that they can make the micromale for anyone.
Yeah, that is true.
Mostly marketed at dwarfs, so of course they're going to have dwarf appropriate sizes. Grace makes the point that is it like using a thin model for a plus size clothing line, and I think there is.
I mean, it absolutely is, and also that thing of who are the plus size models, and who counts, which again has changed a lot in the last 15 years. Like the world of fashion has changed, and the options for plus size women have changed a lot, and even the language around it. Because we've just come off Christmas, right? Which means an avalanche of social media pretty much talking about nothing but Love Actually for like the last 4 weeks. It might just be my algorithm on Threads. I don't know what I blinked at in order to make this happen. But I remember something that people were starting to talk about was that Martine McCutcheon is referred to so often in that film as being chunky, as being fat. And it's like, oh my God. And then somebody else, there was this whole conversation about, do you remember the 90s where Kate Winslet was like seen as the plus sized actor?
Oh, so weird.
And it's like, yeah, no, it was grim times, man. But this whole thing of like, well, what counts as plus sized? What counts as an unrealistic body type? The really nastiness comes in where you have the designers who absolutely refuse to create outfits for anybody larger than a coat hanger, at which point just put it on a coat hanger. But yeah, I think it is equivalent, and I think the Juliet thing is acknowledging that there is a reason that very pretty thin women tend to do a lot better naturally in any kind of entertainment industry than those who aren't. Of course, there are an awful lot of very pretty thin women who don't, because they don't also have the talent and the luck to kind of take it further. Yeah. There's a lot going on there.
I think it is two questions, and I absolutely agree that it is like using a thin model for a plus size line, and it does not show how the clothes would look on just someone off the street, anyone who's looking to buy these clothes. As I said earlier. In terms of being cultural appropriation, that's a complex question, because like cultural appropriation is already complicated in our real life society, where there's a lot of different schools of thought depending on within the culture. And so it depends on what the culture itself thinks. My rudimentary thoughts on this is it wouldn't, because this line of clothing is for a new frontier for dwarves. Yeah. They don't already have like female clothing for dwarves. And also in this marketplace for it, a lot of humans are actually already there. So the created culture around female clothing for whoever's buying from this store, really, and buying this chainmail, who is that culture? It seems to be a mixture of quite a diverse group, actually. So I don't know. I think that's a more complicated question.
I feel like the cultural appropriation would come if Juliet basically set up her own dwarf chainmail, which would be that.
Yes.
Yeah. But the fact that Madame is a dwarf and is literally putting the clothes, and an equivalent I've seen like discussed a lot is the thing of white women wearing, say, Indian attire at an Indian wedding. And it's like, if your friend is Indian and literally like is like, yes, I want you to wear a sari at my wedding, then you're walking down the street dressed for the wedding and 3 white women tell you that you're culturally appropriated. You know, there's this whole thing going on where sometimes we leap to cultural appropriation, but sometimes cultural things are meant to be shared and you don't always know the context. And we do see the context here, which is that literally if anybody is being like predatory in this situation, it is 100% not Juliet.
Yeah.
But you can see how it could go that way, particularly if dwarf fashions were being tailored for humans. There's a lot of potential problematic outcomes, but we're not there yet in the book.
So, look, we'd love to get through all the questions that we got sent in.
Oh, they're so good.
We just don't have time, but we've got time. We'll get through a couple more. A couple of people asked this question. So obviously this book's about football, but we met Arthur on Facebook and Ian on Discord both asked a version of the question, what other sport would we like to see get the Discworld treatment or arrive in Ankh-Morpork?
It's a great question. Very tough.
See, I was thinking particularly as an unseen university sport, and the first one that came to mind was synchronized swimming. Can you imagine, though, in the Ankh?
No.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
The casualties.
I feel like the assassins are always involved in something like one of these like really long-term games of tag or like an elaborate scavenger hunt that like has actually lasted for 25 years.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
And it's always in play despite all the other things that they're doing,
Yeah.
I think a chess book would do quite well under Terry Pratchett's hand.
And I mean, we do have Thud, which is kind of the equivalent, I guess.
A specific chess one.
We do know that there is chess on Discworld because there's Assassin's Chess, which has the slurks down the side where assassins kind of disappear off the board and then come back again.
Wouldn't a chess book just be like Veterinary and Margalotta playing chess while holding each other's eye contact?
Yeah. Then the other place my brain went to was croquet, but I feel like Alice in Wonderland did that well, and Jasper Fforde has done that well. So I think like we've covered croquet well.
Yeah,
but it would be fun.
Yeah, like a full city version of croquet, where the hoops are sort of set up across the city, perhaps even the rooftops and everything, and everybody gets really into it, like a cross between croquet and parkour. And Fimes would hate it so much.
Yeah.
But I think you nailed it with football because you get a big team in there and you get to see the weird dynamics, whereas everything else I'm thinking of like tennis or badminton or anything, or even individual ones, you get deep in on one character or a partnership, but you don't get to see like the chaotic group energy that you do from something like this.
Yeah. Maybe an undead fun run.
Oh,
a marathon would be interesting.
That is funny. Yeah. I'm also thinking, like, what sports tropes do I want to see? Because we've got team sports covered by this book. We don't need, like, a hockey book because that would cover a lot of the same ground.
Tennis doubles, then. But badminton.
Or cricket. I mean, Maybe the thing is a touring team might be interesting, like a team coming from somewhere else to
competitive
play.
Megapode.
So it could be a cricket book, and it could be the 4X team coming to Ankh-Morpork.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah, something like expanding the Megapode, but into a larger, more international sport.
International.
It's like the Amazing Race, but like the Megapode.
Oh,
yeah,
actually,
now you're talking my language.
Look,
yeah,
if they finally get around to making another computer game set in the Discworld, which should have happened by now, I'm just so angry it hasn't, then something based on the Amazing Race but in the Discworld would be fantastic.
Yeah, but who would you pair up? Because like it has to be Rid Cully and Ponderous Tippins as one of them.
Well, if it's a computer game, you get to choose.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it always that's the thing. The fact that it would have to be twos and they have to know each other.
Sam and Sybil.
Yeah.
Sam wouldn't do it.
Carrot and Angua.
Yeah.
They would do it.
Oh, that would end their relationship. They would absolutely not. Their relationship would not survive that, I feel.
No, I think they'd thrive and possibly win.
Okay. And you're going to have Granny and Nanny.
Out in the first round, but then like they're in the background of everything being like, nah, I wouldn't do it that way.
Yeah.
I think they'd all have to be in another city that we've never been to before, so it's all weird for them.
Well,
and
the
weird
thing
for
about the
us.
Amazing, you'd go from city to city. It would be a tour.
Oh, that's true. It's international.
So
isn't it?
They keep moving, and that's
got to keep moving. Yeah.
Oh, that's quite good. Okay, I like that. That's a great answer.
Cheery and detritus.
Could you please? So anyone, this is hashtag Pratchat83. Who would you like to see paired up for the Discworld Amazing Race, and how well do you think they would do?
Yeah.
Incredible.
Amazing, I think you mean.
Moist and Lord Veterinary.
God.
Veterinary
So
on
good.
his own.
Yeah,
No,
he
he's
wouldn't pair
the
up with
judge.
anyone.
He just gets very drunk.
And he's waiting on the mat. He's doing all the Bo Ryan stuff, like at each cultural place.
What if it's like, he's retired and he's bored, so he tricks a bunch of people into doing this amazing race thing.
And half of them don't make it out of Lanka. Like half the pairs just utterly sabotaged by Lanka. They just can't. Yeah.
Who would be paired with Death?
Yeah, it ends up in 4X and like nobody makes it home. They all just like start running a pub together.
Death and someone normal.
Ooh.
Wow.
No, Death and one of his ones from when he was like the farmer, like one of his pals that he made there.
Death and Rincewind.
Ooh.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, okay.
It's like, now you're not even following me. We're just in the same hot air balloon.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I like that idea, actually. Yeah, Death and...
Okay, that's very good.
Yeah,
That's
the
very
Amazing
good.
Race is a sport. We've solved it.
Yeah.
I'm going to throw out a couple of short ones to finish it off. Molokov on Discord asked, what's your favourite pie?
That is a brilliant question. I think that's the best
question.
question.
You can go sweet or savoury with this because Glenda makes
Always
both.
savoury. And I recently went to New Zealand, which do they not tell us this in Australia? But New Zealand loves pies and makes amazing ones and makes all of our pies here look like shit. So like,
Really?
yeah, like if you've enjoyed a pie in Australia, then you go to New Zealand and you enjoy a pie. You come back here, you're like, what are we doing? So,
Wow.
basically most New Zealand pies is my favourite pie.
Did you have a particular one that stood out, though?
No, I went to the shop where they have a different special like every 2 days and they come up with 3 different new pies and then they have this like chart on the wall of all the pies they've ever made and it's amazing. So, yeah. And you have a choice of 3 new ones. So,
Okay, that sounds amazing. Look, I gotta say, I like an egg and bacon pie. I think that's a lot, it's classic. For those international listeners, the Australian egg and bacon pie requires pretty good bacon, ideally stripped, but sometimes it's just like the little nubs of bacon, but then the eggs have to be cracked directly into the pastry. So it's like they have to be whole eggs. Otherwise it's a quiche. It's a whole different thing. But I like an egg and bacon pie. Also, as a Tasmanian, I have to represent the scallop pie.
what?
Oh,
Is
yes.
that potatoes or is that seafood?
No, seafood
It is
scallops.
absolutely seafood.
Yes, okay, we're on the
potato
same
scallops
page.
don't exist
Good.
in Tasmania.
Yeah, okay, good.
No. It is the seafood scallop. A good one will have at least 6 scallops in an individual pie. It'll be in a curry sauce, like a creamy curry sauce. Sometimes they put a little bit of carrot in there, which does distract you by thinking there is more scallop roe than you think. Because obviously the scallops also have to have the roe on, because in Tasmania we don't cut it off for anything. Not even in a fancy restaurant. We get very angry when people cut off our scallop roe. That's like half the scallop. Anyway,
I'm learning.
we have a lot of feelings about scallop pies, and you should all come to Tasmania and eat our scallop
No,
pies.
I love Tasmania. I also would like to add, I love a shepherd's pie. Just generally, like it's hard to
Yeah.
mess it up, and if you do, I'm angry. But like shepherd's pie is a solid choice generally most of the time.
Absolutely.
Look, one of my favorite cafes of all time, I don't go that much anymore because it's not near where I live anymore, but it's Green Refectory in Sydney Road, Brunswick.
Very good.
Highly recommend. They make amazing cakes, but they also make very good pies. And I used to, when I still ate meat a long time ago, I loved their chicken and leek pie, which is amazing.
Sound good.
But they also make a couple of amazing vegetarian pies, one of which is, it's been so long since I had one. One is halloumi and something else. I've forgotten what the other thing is, but so good. And they make a really good mushroom one as well. And they were delicious. So they're my favorite.
I have to throw in there, my husband makes the dreamiest fish pie. We only do it probably maybe once every couple of years because it is epic and a little bit horrifying. It involves like just full on chunks of salmon, like just big wadges of salmon in there. Sometimes scallops as well, just to sort of in between, but mostly it's salmon. And a really thick cheese sauce made with a vintage cheddar. It's basically a Thermidor sauce. He kind of got this recipe from a chef from a restaurant that we loved and is long since retired and closed down. And then puff pastry. And it's made like family size and you have a really big wadge. And then when it goes cold, it is solid.
Sounds so good.
So good.
How long's it been since he made it? Because is it time?
Yeah, I'm thinking about it. We didn't have one this year, and I'm thinking maybe I could talk him into doing it for New Year's.
Nice.
It is my favorite.
That sounds like the time. All right, last question. Now that we've all made ourselves hungry with this pie talk. This is from Sven on Discord. If you were to make a big grant to a university or another institution, what slightly strange and eccentric requirements would the institution have to fulfill?
See, I love this question. When you sent me the document earlier and I saw it, and it resonates with me so much because I actually benefited from one of these scholarships.
Oh, wow.
So there is a lovely gentleman. I don't know if he was lovely. He might have been an asshole. I don't know. There was this gentleman called Professor Dunbabin about whom I will always feel fond. He died before I joined the university, possibly before I was born. But the money he bequeathed the University of Tasmania is, for a start, the reason that our Classics Museum still exists, because no one's been able to figure out how to, siphon the money into any other thing. So there's this tiny, beautiful little Classics Museum behind the cafe on a campus that they're trying to destroy. And the whole Classics department has pretty much only survived as an adjunct of the history department because they can't divert this money. The Dunbabin Scholarship was also available for postgraduate students to send them overseas for travel to do with their thesis. So I had a month in Rome looking at statues for my PhD thesis, which was one of the best experiences of my life. And all thanks to a dead professor who left a bunch of money tied up in weird, complicated ways that they still can't get rid of. So, bless you, Professor Dunbabin. I don't know what I would do, but I like to think I would be at least as sneaky about it if I did.
Wow.
That's amazing, first of all.
Yeah.
I've been thinking about this one, and I think I would make it so that either the second most senior librarian gets to choose the recipient, or an unsung staff member who sees things but is not sucked up to. Universities get a lot of bequests and things, so I'd like to have it to be a scholarship of some kind, and I'd like to go to someone who might not put themselves forward, perhaps. So I would like it to be in the hands of someone who doesn't have all of the power, but who sees things, who can choose.
So an academic wallflower award?
Exactly. So someone who could benefit from it, who would deserve it, but who might not see that in themselves, and who might not be good at the application process, but who would get a lot out of it. So
yeah, we'd have to have a very simple application process because those are the worst.
So basically, there is no application process. The caveat is that the second, it's like, who do you see the most? Like you go to the library if you're that person, perhaps, or if you go to a particular place. So, but not the most senior person, the second most senior person, so that there's less of that power dynamic as well.
Lovely.
Okay, I like that. I was looking at this and I feel like I'm leaning into the sort of games angle again, but I think my stipulation would be that in order to receive the money, the senior faculty of the institution would have to play a role-playing game designed by and run by a student.
Ooh, that's interesting.
Like a different student each year.
So the student DMs and the faculty are the players.
And it's a game they've made, so it's not like a game of Dungeons and Dragons or something. It's like a game that the student has designed.
Oh, that's interesting. And then does the money go like half and half to like the faculty and the student? Or does it just go, who does it go to?
Well, I think it's bequeathed to the institution, but I'm imagining an arts institution that has a game design course.
Okay.
And this pays for the game design course, but a stipulation of it is, the senior staff have to get down and play the games that the students design.
Okay, but I feel like the student that does the design should at least get like their fees paid for them.
Oh, they get an award. They get they get like a prize awarded. Like someone picks the most interesting game, and that's the one that the senior faculty have to play.
That is really cool. Yeah. One of the nicest things that happened to myself and my husband at the last Discworld convention was we've been chatting with a fellow there who I'd seen at a few events. He was the guy who brought the Discworld game to our panel. Like he had the proper one. Yeah.
Listener of this podcast.
Yeah. So we sort of chatted across panels and things. And at one point we were just standing in a corridor and he's just like, do you want to play a game? And Finch and I were just like, yeah, well, we've got a bit of time. We'll come play a game. And we all went and sat down at the table. He's like, here's one that I designed. And it was amazing. It was so cool. There were hedgehogs. And it was kind of based on Alice in Wonderland croquet, but it was a board game. And there were little tiny hedgehogs to play. And I got so into it. And I was very sad I had to like leave at one point to go and be on a panel I was scheduled for. But it was just such a nice thing of like, come and play a game. Oh, by the way, of the board games I'm carrying, here's one that I've designed. Like, how cool is that? So
very cool.
Yes.
And
cool.
David, if you're listening, thank you for bringing your games to the con.
So much joy.
We had a great time playing.
Some of my favorite memories. Can I quickly add, for mine, a side point of it being chosen by like an unsung member of faculty or the second librarian is that no one can know that this bequest exists. That's a caveat of receiving it, and it's hidden in the annual general report under just like bequest. You don't know that it hasn't got a specific name, hasn't got a thing. It's a set amount, but it's just someone's like, that person could do with it. They'll do good things with it. They're a good recipient. There's criteria, but they get it, and you sign a thing to say that you can't talk about it. So
like an NDA.
So no one can gun for it, basically, is the thing.
See, the secret aspect is what immediately has now turned this into an amazing plot for a novel. Like, before that, it was a pretty cool maybe thing, but as soon as you got that, it's like, yeah, no, that's like a
secret bequest.
It's like a weird little thriller that kind of, you're going to investigate who put the money in your account and why.
Why is it there? What is it for?
Yeah.
Do I have to give back?
No. Yeah. They get to know like they've received a thing for whatever reason, but they can't tell people that there's a bequest that happens every year.
That's very cool.
Well, look, that kind of brings us to the end. I feel like we barely touched the surface. There's this immense book. There's so much to say about it. But what a joy it was to talk about it with you, Tansy. Thank you so much for coming. Sorry, Dr. Tansy Rayner Roberts, PhD, Brackets Classics.
It was worth the wait.
Now, you've got lots of stuff happening. As we record this, you're finishing up a Kickstarter for some special editions of your Teacup Magic books.
Yes. I'll be doing another one next year. But probably of all the projects I am doing, the thing that is probably of most interest is that apart from the Pratchett's Women book of essays that I wrote many years ago, that is still the gift that keeps giving, I am now writing a regular column for Speculative Insight, which is an online science fiction magazine. About half the pieces in the really interesting critical work on science fiction and fantasy, about half of it is subscriber locked and half of it is free for public. And that goes for my column. I'm basically writing every 2 months a Pratchett essay on the theme of Pratchett's Men, which, you know, for many years people are like, but where are the Pratchett's Men essays, Tansy?
That's fantastic.
But it's a fantastic magazine, Speculative Insight. I recommend people check it out and check out the subscription. And she puts out, for those who don't want to subscribe, like an annual collection of all the essays that gets published either as a book or as an ebook. But so people can buy the whole collection if they want to.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Well,
that's it.
You should check those out. That's Speculative Insight. And if they want to find out more about your other books and works, Tansy? TansyRR.com is my website. You can check out my Patreon. I'm at TansyRR on all the social media except X because I set fire to it and walked away very slowly. I haven't actually officially left. I just don't go on there anymore. But I'm on all the others. I'm trying to make Blue Sky and Threads a thing. I haven't quite really committed to either yet, but I'm there. Fair.
So feel free to ask me questions and stuff like that.
Yeah. And if you're asking questions about this episode, you can use the hashtag Pratchat83, or you can find us on social media. We're on there as well. We are on Blue Sky. We're not on Threads, but we are on Blue Sky and Mastodon. We are still on X. I feel like I've been there so long that I'll,
Yeah.
I'm there, but I'm
I
not.
just have the cord.
Like,
it's hard to go. But we're there. We're also on Facebook and Instagram, so you can find us on all those things. We're Pratchat Podcast. So please let us know. What did we miss? I mean, there's so much. We could have talked about heaps of things.
Yeah.
But we'll be back. We'll be back next month with 2 books, but not novels. And in fact, three books, because we're going to be looking at the Ankh-Morpork Archives, Volume 1 and Volume 2, and the Discworld Almanac. And these are collections of Discworld ephemera, all kinds of stuff. The Archives books are collections of content from the Discworld diaries, and the Almanac was kind of published instead of a diary one year. So we're going to look at all that kind of stuff. It's going to be a lot of fun. The hashtag, if you've got questions for that, is Pratchat84. You can send in questions about any of the stuff from any of those diaries that are covered by those books. We'll have details on our website. Thank you for listening, and thank you for subscribing, for supporting the show. If you want to support the show, you can do that either just by telling people who you think would like it about it, or you can send us some money if you want. You can get on our website, pratchatpodcast.com, and find out how you can support the show with actual cash money if you want to. It's absolutely optional, but we do really appreciate all of you who do it, because you make it possible for us to make this show and get it out every month. And look, Liz, I don't know if I want to say this too early, but I feel like this is probably, let's be honest about this, 2025, it's probably the last year of Pratchat. I think we're going to finish the podcast this year.
I refuse to engage with that comment in any way.
They keep putting out new books.
We haven't done an episode on the Hogfather TV series or anything. No. This is me engaging with the comment I said I wouldn't engage with, so here we go.
There's more stuff, but I feel like we're definitely going to finish the novels this year. We'll see how that goes.
Yeah.
But we're in the end game of our 6-ish year mission as we enter our 7/8 year. It's a long project, folks. We're getting to the end. But thank you for coming with us and listening as we get through these last few Discworld novels. There's only 3 left that we haven't done, and that's both exciting and scary. But there are a few other books and a few other things that we haven't done yet either, so we will be with you for at least another year. So thank you so much for listening and being with us. And until next time, there's only one macarona. There's only one macaroni.
You're doing it wrong. No. You've got to read the whole title.
You've been listening for rather longer than usual to Pratchat, the monthly Terry Pratchett Book Club podcast with Pratchatters Elizabeth Flux, Ben McKenzie, that's me, and guest Dr. Tansy Rayner Roberts, PhD, Classics. Pratchat is produced and edited by me on the unceded country of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung peoples of the Kulin Nation. Our music is by David Ashton. We're on social media as Pratchat or Pratchat Podcast, and you can listen to past episodes and support the production of new ones via pratchatpodcast.com. Join the conversation for this episode using the hashtag Pratchat83.
Pratchat is brought to you by Splendid Chaps Productions. We make entertainment for your ears, like the Doctor Who podcast Splendid Chaps and time travel comedy series Night Terrors. To find out more, visit splendidchaps.com.